Family Guy is the cartoon where nothing has to add up. The chaos is the whole point. But the strangest gaps in the show hold together far more tightly than anyone admits. The darkest theory starts with Peter Griffin alone, imagining all of it, and that is where it begins. This is every Family Guy fan theory. Peter Griffin is not the main character. He is the only character. Something quiet sits underneath the first few minutes of almost any Family Guy episode. Peter says something stupid. Lois corrects him. Meg gets ignored. The baby says something unexpectedly sophisticated in a British accent. The dog orders a martini. It feels like a normal dysfunctional family, exaggerated for comedy, operating under cartoon logic that most viewers accept without question because the jokes come fast enough that the gaps between them never stay open long enough to look at properly. And then, somewhere around the middle of the episode, Peter ends up in a situation that should have ended his life 3 times over, and the family wakes up next week exactly where they started, with no memory of anything that happened, ready to do it all over again. That reset is the piece most viewers accept most easily. Cartoons reset. That is a known rule of the format. Characters walk away from explosions. Bones heal between scenes. Nobody ages. The debt of logic that animated sitcoms accumulate simply gets forgiven because the audience agrees, without anyone saying so out loud, to treat each episode as its own sealed-off world. Family Guy asks for that agreement more aggressively than almost any other animated show, piling impossible event on top of impossible event, leaning harder into the reset with every season, until the show has built up such an enormous debt of unresolved consequences that the whole structure only holds together if the audience stops asking why none of it sticks. A Reddit user posting under the name B-blank0308 stopped asking why none of it sticks and asked a different question instead. The theory posted by this user in 2012, originally in the fan theories section of the site, begins from a very simple premise. What if the reason nothing in Family Guy has consequences is not because it is a cartoon, but because none of it is real, including the family? The theory went on to become one of the most widely shared pieces of fan writing connected to the show, eventually going viral on TikTok more than a decade after it was first posted, with a single video discussing the theory collecting nearly 5 million views. The reason it keeps traveling is not because it is particularly elaborate, it is because, once heard, it explains an unusual number of things at once, in a way that casual acceptance of cartoon logic never quite manages. The theory begins not with Peter but with Meg, and with a version of Meg that looks nothing like the girl the show presents. In the real world behind the story, before anything went wrong, Meg was not awkward or unpopular or constantly belittled by the people around her. According to the theory, the real Meg Griffin was a beautiful, well-liked teenager, someone her family was genuinely proud of. Her younger brother Chris, in this version of events, was born with a developmental disability caused by a lack of oxygen during birth. The kind Meg in the real story formed a deep bond with Chris because of this, feeling protective of him in a way that the rest of the family also did, but that Meg expressed more directly through her daily attention to him. One night, Meg took Chris to a party. The details of how the night ended are the pivot on which the entire theory turns. Meg had been drinking. Chris had a panic attack. She decided to take him home anyway, got behind the wheel in a state she should not have, and crashed the car. Both Meg and Chris died in the accident. Lois, who was pregnant at the time, could not survive the grief of losing 2 of her children at once. She took her own life. Peter, who had not been in the car and had not been able to stop any of it from happening, was the only one left standing. He was alone, with a wife and 2 children dead, and a 3rd child who had not yet been born and would never be born now, and he broke. He ended up in a mental institution. The world inside Family Guy, the entire show, every episode, every joke, every impossible event and reset is the interior of Peter Griffin's unraveling mind, replaying a version of his life where the people he lost are somehow still there. This is the premise. The theory then works through what it explains, and the list is worth taking slowly rather than rushing past, because each piece fits the structure in a way that is specific enough to feel designed rather than coincidental. Start with Meg. The Meg inside the show is treated by her own family with a contempt that has struck even casual viewers as extreme, extending well beyond the usual cruelty of dysfunctional sitcom families into something that feels deliberately mean-spirited without a clear in-universe reason. Peter in particular targets her in ways that sometimes go beyond mere cartoon bumbling. The theory explains this directly. Peter's imagined world preserves Meg as someone who is still alive, because part of him cannot function without that. But another part of him, the part that blames her for everything that happened, cannot stop punishing her for it either. The show keeps her present but keeps her suffering, which is exactly what rage and grief fighting each other inside a broken mind would produce. The love occasionally breaks through in small moments of unexpected warmth that even the show itself acknowledges as anomalies before the default cruelty reasserts itself. Chris, in the show's version of events, is not dead. He is a large, kind, somewhat dim teenager who stumbles through his life without much ambition or self-awareness. The theory suggests that Peter could not bring himself to erase Chris entirely, so he kept accept him, but shaped him according to the real Chris's limitations, the developmental disability that the actual boy had struggled with from birth. The show's Chris is not cruel. He is mostly gentle, easily confused, living at a lower level of understanding than the people around him. He is the closest thing in the show to a version of the real boy Peter lost, preserved in amber, kept exactly as his actual limitations would have made him, because Peter's mind would have no other way to reconstruct him. Stewie is the most haunting piece of the theory. He is a child who was never born. Peter lost him before he ever had the chance to exist, and Stewie's extreme intelligence in the show reflects a specific kind of grief, the grief of someone imagining what a person could have been, rather than remembering who they actually were. Parents who lose unborn children sometimes describe an almost unbearable habit of imagining the future that was taken from them. Peter's version of that imagined future is a 1-year-old baby who builds time machines and speaks in complete sentences about geopolitical philosophy. The unborn Stewie was given every capability Peter ever wished he could have watched a son develop. He was made extraordinary precisely because he never had to exist in the ordinary world to earn it. The connection between Stewie and Lois inside the show also fits this reading in a specific way. Stewie's most famous early storyline involved his obsessive desire to kill Lois. Most viewers read this as an absurdist running gag with no deeper meaning attached. The theory reads it as Peter's own complicated anger at his wife for leaving him, expressed through the child she carried when she died. The unborn baby who died with Lois becomes, in the imagined world, a child who wants her dead. That is not a cartoon gag once the underlying context is understood. It is something far darker, the rage of a widower made literal through the imagined mouth of the child he lost. Brian deserves careful attention separately from the family members, because the theory handles him differently. Peter in the real world was, the theory argues, not the dim, impulsive man he appears to be in the show. He was someone reasonably intelligent who simply felt, after the deaths of his family, that his intelligence had failed him completely by not preventing what happened. He imagines himself as stupid because he perceived himself as having failed in the fundamental task intelligence is supposed to help a person accomplish, keeping the people he loved safe. But that intelligence did not disappear. It needed somewhere to go, so Peter gave it to the dog. Brian is not a magical talking animal. Brian is Peter's own mind, the part of himself he can no longer inhabit after what happened, outsourced into a form that seems separate from him, sophisticated enough to be trusted, but just different enough that Peter does not have to own the shame attached to being smart and still failing. This detail about Brian maps onto something the show itself actually does. Brian is consistently the voice that names what is wrong with situations Peter creates, the one who sees consequences coming that Peter ignores, the one who holds on to something resembling adult competence while the rest of the house collapses around a joke. He is also notably the one character in the show who has the most explicitly articulated inner life, writing novels, attending therapy-adjacent conversations, grappling with ideas larger than the plot of the week. If Peter constructed him as the container for his own lost self-image, the show's treatment of Brian makes a strange kind of sense. He is the man Peter used to believe he was, living inside a dog, because that man no longer feels accessible. The neighbors complete the picture in a way that makes the theory feel unusually complete for something built around a single dark premise. Cleveland and Quagmire, in this reading, are real people. They lived on Peter's street. They visited him in the institution after everything collapsed, trying to reach their friend by playing along with the world he was constructing in his mind, because the alternative was simply watching him sit alone in silence. They appear inside the show as neighbors and drinking companions, because those visits are the real events the hallucination is wrapping itself around. Every time Cleveland or Quagmire show up at the Drunken Clam with Peter in the show, in the real version of events, those two men are sitting with their friend in a hospital, attempting to maintain a connection to someone who can only communicate through a fantasy. Joe is different, and the theory handles Joe with a specific detail that most retellings include because it is one of the most emotionally precise pieces of the whole construction. Peter never actually met Joe. Cleveland and Quagmire told Peter about the new neighbor who had moved into the house on the street, a man with a disability, a wife, a son, and a baby on the way. Peter, hearing about this man through the stories his friends brought to the institution, incorporated him into the imagined world. But Peter's version of Joe is not drawn from reality. It is drawn from aspiration. Joe Swanson is the father and husband Peter believed he should have been, heroic and devoted and unconditionally loving. A man whose physical disability does not diminish his role in his family the way Peter felt his psychological collapse had diminished his own role in his. Peter built Joe as the ideal he had failed to live up to, given a name and a face and a house next door. Cleveland's eventual departure from the show, reframed by the spin-off series The Cleveland Show, also fits inside the theory in a way that was not part of the original construction but extends naturally from it. The theory suggests that Cleveland, having visited Peter for a long period of time and participated in the imagined world long enough to keep his friend company, eventually found that the experience of helping sustain someone else's hallucination was beginning to affect perfect his own grip on reality. He stepped back. He stopped visiting as regularly. From inside the hallucination, that departure looks like Cleveland moving to a new city and getting his own show. From outside the hallucination, it looks like a man choosing to protect his own mental health by reducing his exposure to a situation he could no longer sustain without cost to himself. The escalating chaos of the show across its later seasons fits the theory as naturally as any individual character detail. Early Family Guy is a strange but recognizable family sitcom. The humor is cutting, the situations are exaggerated, but the show operates within a gravitational field that still pulls its stories towards something resembling ordinary life. As the seasons progress, that gravitational pull weakens and then largely disappears. Episodes become exercises in how far from any recognizable reality the writers can travel within 22 minutes. The show begins to feel less like a family stumbling through life and more like a series of unconnected events held together only by the persistence of the same character models. The theory reads this escalation as the deepening of the mental break itself. The further from the original event in time, the more completely the mind filling the show with content loses contact with anything resembling the real world it is supposedly reconstructing. The cutaway gags, which are the show's most distinctive formal device and also its most frequently criticized one, fit the theory in a way that is worth sitting with. A cutaway gag in Family Guy typically works by breaking away from whatever scene is happening to show an entirely unconnected piece of action, often absurd, often violent, entirely disconnected from anything that came before it, and then returning to the original scene as though nothing happened. Critics of the show have argued for years that this device replaced storytelling with a series of random images strung together by nothing more than a character's offhand comparison. The theory turns this criticism into evidence. A mind in the kind of dissociative state the theory is describing would not produce a clean, continuous story. It would produce exactly this: a stream of loosely connected images, some of them funny, some of them disturbing, all of them arising from the same broken source, with no accountability to each other and no requirement that any of them make sense from one moment to the next. The theory was posted in 2012 and went largely unnoticed for years, before reaching a much wider audience when TikTok allowed it to travel far beyond the spaces where fan theories typically live. One TikTok video discussing it collected nearly 5 million views after a user described it as one of the scariest things they had encountered connected to the show. What made it scary, according to the comments on that video, was not the content of the tragedy at the center of the theory, though that content is genuinely dark. What made it scary was the recognition that the theory does not require anything about the show to change. It does not contradict a single episode. It does not rewrite a single piece of dialogue. It simply places a different frame around material that was already there, and that reframing changes almost everything a viewer had previously assumed about what they were watching. That is the particular quality that separates this theory from most fan theories, which typically require either a piece of overlooked evidence or a deliberate piece of hidden writing to work as intended. This one works without either. The show can be exactly what it appears to be on its surface: a loud, chaotic, sometimes cruel cartoon about a family in Rhode Island, and also contain this underneath it simultaneously, not hidden by the writers but present nonetheless, the way a shadow is present in bright sunlight without needing anyone to have placed it there deliberately. The chaos and the darkness and the specific cruelties embedded in the show's treatment of its own characters can all remain exactly as they are. The theory simply asks the viewer to consider that the chaos is not accidental, and that the cruelties have a source, and that the source is a man sitting alone in a room somewhere in Rhode Island, keeping everyone he loved alive the only way he still can. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The theory that all of Family Guy lives inside Peter's mind is the darkest reading the show has ever generated, and it works precisely because nothing about the show needs to change for it to fit. But a very different kind of question has followed the show almost from its first episode, one that does not require an imagined tragedy to make sense of, only a single baby who has never quite decided who he actually is. Section 2. The baby who built a persona. Most characters in animated comedy exist in one piece. The writers decide who they are in the first few episodes and the audience accepts it, building 20 years of familiarity on top of a foundation that was set before anyone knew whether the show would survive its first season. Stewie Griffin is the exception to nearly everything about that process. The show has been running since 1999, and the people who make it still cannot fully agree on what Stewie is, what he sounds like underneath the voice he uses, who he is attracted to, or even whether the things he does are real events in the world of the story or something else entirely. That uncertainty is not a failure of writing. According to the people who write the show, it is a deliberate choice. The uncertainty is the whole point. The problem is that decades of building jokes on top of unresolved questions have left a character who is, in some specific ways, more fascinating to examine than almost anyone else in the show's history. Stewie was designed in the original pitch as a straightforward villain, a baby with an adult mind and a British accent, mutant, obsessed with killing his mother and achieving world domination, whose plans are constantly foiled by the incompetence of being 1 year old in a world built for people who can reach doorknobs. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that he modeled the voice specifically on the English actor Rex Harrison, drawing particularly from Harrison's performance in the 1964 musical My Fair Lady, the voice of a precise, imperious, deeply self-assured man who treats everyone around him as slightly beneath his standards. The result was a character who immediately stood apart from everything else in the show, a formal, clipped, carefully enunciated British accent floating out of a small American baby in a Rhode Island house, surrounded by people with New England accents who never seemed to find this particularly strange. For the first season or so, the joke was the gap between Stewie's ambitions and his circumstances. He was a megalomaniac trapped in a high chair, a would-be dictator whose plots kept getting interrupted by nap time. The humor was simple, and the character was essentially a single joke premise, a very specific exaggeration of the idea that babies secretly hate their mothers and resent being helpless. Then the show leaned further into two separate questions that had been quietly accumulating since the beginning. The first was about Stewie's sexuality. The second was about whether any of it, the accent, the intelligence, the cruelty, was actually who Stewie was, or whether it was something he had built to survive being the person he actually was underneath. The sexuality question began as a background detail. In the show's second season, as the writers started developing Stewie beyond the generic supervillain setup, small jokes began appearing that suggested Stewie might not be oriented the way a conventional male character in a conventional family sitcom was expected to be. A screensaver on his phone showing a muscular man, a wallet containing a photo of a male actor, an alter ego named Desiree with a history of male romantic partners, a recurring fantasy involving his stuffed bear, Rupert, imagined as an athletic man with a bear's head, comments about finding certain male figures attractive, delivered with the same casual certainty Stewie brings to everything else he says. None of these were framed as a storyline. They were jokes, dropped in and moved past, building up over seasons into a running background assumption shared between the show and its audience. Seth MacFarlane addressed this directly in an interview that circulated widely, stating that the writers all felt Stewie was almost certainly gay and that they had been treating him as a gay character in the writer's room for some time, even without making it explicit on screen. He added that when Stewie grows up, the likely outcomes were either a gay adult or a deeply repressed and unhappy straight man, neither of which sounded particularly optimistic. That statement, made publicly and attributed to the show's own creator, became the widely accepted answer to the question for a long time. Stewie was gay. The show just had not said so directly yet. Fans filed the information and moved on. Then the show itself started producing evidence that complicated the picture. Episodes appeared in which Stewie fell in love with a female toddler named Janet, pursuing her with the same single-minded intensity he usually brought to military planning. MacFarlane described Stewie in this episode as a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual, which was a different explanation than anything the writer's room statement had suggested. Other episodes added to the confusion, with Stewie expressing attraction in directions that did not line up cleanly with any stable identity, seemingly changing based on whatever the joke of the week required. MacFarlane would later partially walk back his earlier statement, pointing out that cartoon characters cannot truly be described as straight or gay because they are not real people with fixed orientations. They are constructions that can be written in whatever direction serves the story at a given moment. That clarification did not quite resolve anything. It simply acknowledged that the question was never going to produce a clean answer. The episode that brought all of this to a head arrived in March 2018, in the 16th season, on the occasion of the show's 300th episode. The episode is called Send In Stewie Please, and it aired without commercial interruption, an unusual distinction that signaled the production team considered it something distinct from the usual run of episodes. The entire runtime is essentially a two-character scene, with Stewie sitting in the office of a school therapist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, played by Sir Ian McKellen, who has been called in to speak with Stewie after an incident involving a younger classmate. What follows is the closest the show has ever come to a genuine psychological portrait of who Stewie Griffin actually is, and the answers it provides are stranger and more interesting than a simple revelation of sexual orientation. The sexuality question is addressed almost immediately, with Stewie telling Pritchfield not to expect a coming-out conversation. He then describes his own orientation using the word fluid, before immediately questioning whether the word heterosexual is even a real one. The show's writer Gary Janetti, speaking to entertainment journalists after the episode aired, explained that the decision was to keep Stewie's sexuality genuinely unresolved rather than settling it, because the uncertainty was felt to be more true to who Stewie is as a person. A one-year-old does not have a settled adult identity in any direction. His confusion, Janetti argued, gives him a vulnerability that a definitive answer would eliminate. Executive producer Rich Appel added that Seth MacFarlane himself had weighed in with the preference that the sexuality not be leaned into too heavily, on the grounds that a baby simply does not know yet, and that sexuality is too fluid a thing to pin down in a character who is perpetually a toddler. This explanation has a certain honesty to it. The show is genuinely not interested in finishing the sentence. What made the episode more memorable than its handling of the sexuality question, though, was the revelation that arrived alongside it, the one that most viewers had not specifically been anticipating, about Stewie's voice. At some point during the therapy session, Stewie reveals to Pritchfield that the British accent is not real. It is, in Stewie's own description, an affectation, something he put on to get through each day, a kind of armor he constructed because he did not feel like the person he actually was inside would be accepted by the people around him. He then demonstrates his real voice, which sounds like a small American boy, somewhere in the general vicinity of his father's New England accent. The moment he describes as a major confession, the discarding of the persona he has maintained for as long as he can remember lands very differently than he expects. Pritchfield, who is genuinely British, listens carefully and then tells Stewie he cannot hear any difference between the two voices at all. The armor Stewie has been wearing for years turns out to be invisible to the one person he chose to reveal himself to, and the joke of that moment, which MacFarlane delivered with the full range of Stewie's various voices in a sequence that the production team described as partly a comedic reference to the criticism MacFarlane receives for his characters sounding similar, also carries something sadder underneath it. The writer Gary Janetti described the conception of this reveal in terms that are worth sitting with for a moment. The idea behind the fake accent, in his telling, was that someone who genuinely did not feel like they fit in anywhere would be exactly the kind of person to construct an artificial personality and inhabit it so completely that it became indistinguishable from the real thing. The British accent was always Stewie's disguise, not for other characters but for himself, a way of presenting an identity that felt more powerful and more certain than whatever lived underneath it. The episode makes this explicit for the first time, but looking back at the show's history through this lens, it was there from the beginning. Stewie has always been performing a version of himself. The megalomaniacal villain plotting world domination was always a persona built by someone who needed to feel exceptional, because feeling ordinary was unbearable. This idea that Stewie constructed his entire personality as a protective layer over something far less certain connects directly to the fan theory about the show being told from Stewie's perspective. Posted by a Reddit user under the name iFornication, this theory argues that the entire reality of Family Guy is the world as Stewie understands it, filtered through an infant's limited comprehension of events and relationships. The theory's strongest piece of evidence involves the question of who can hear Stewie speak, which has been one of the most persistently discussed inconsistencies in the show across its entire run. Brian always understands Stewie. Chris sometimes does. Peter and Lois seem to understand him in some scenes and hear only baby noises in others, with no pattern clear enough to constitute a rule. The perspective theory explains this by suggesting that the moments when characters cannot hear Stewie are simply the moments when a real baby would not be understood, because real babies are not understood. The show is being filtered through Stewie's own perception of events, which means that the characters who feel emotionally connected to him, Brian above all others, are rendered in the story as characters who hear him clearly. The characters who feel distant or indifferent are rendered as people who hear noise. Peter and Lois's inconsistency is not a writing error. It is a record of how consistently present each of them feels to a baby trying to make sense of the adults in his life, with their apparent attentiveness fluctuating exactly the way a small child's sense of parental availability actually does, not as a fixed fact, but as something that feels different from one day to the next. Seth MacFarlane addressed the hearing question directly in multiple public forums, including a convention panel in 2011, where he stated that everyone in the show can understand Stewie, but that Peter and Lois simply do not take him seriously because he is a baby. This is the official answer from the show's creator, and it is also the answer that generates the most additional questions rather than resolving them. If everyone can hear Stewie clearly, then scenes in which Lois watches him deliver an elaborate speech and responds as though she heard nothing require an explanation that goes beyond adults not taking babies seriously. The show's own 19th season premiere attempted to address this by having Stewie's first word, said at a moment of extreme emotion, suddenly understood by everyone around him, with Stewie concluding afterward that intense emotion is what breaks through the barrier. This explanation covers some episodes reasonably well and creates new problems for others. The honest answer, which the show has occasionally acknowledged through self-aware jokes, is that the writers apply whatever rule produces the funniest outcome in any given scene, and consistency across scenes is not treated as a binding constraint. Stewie can be heard when being heard is funnier. He cannot be heard when not being heard is funnier. The show's relationship to its own internal logic has always been that loose. What the Send in Stewie Please episode reveals is that underneath all of that deliberate looseness, the writers have at some level always known who Stewie actually is. A frightened child who built an extraordinary exterior because the alternative was simply being small and uncertain and unheard, word, in a house full of people too distracted to notice him. The British accent, the genius, the time machine, the world domination schemes, all of it is the armor that the episode finally names as armor. 20 years into the run of a show that spent most of that time using the armor as the joke rather than examining what it was protecting. MacFarlane based the voice on Rex Harrison. The writing team treated the character as almost certainly gay while building jokes that suggested otherwise. A special episode revealed the accent was fake and then immediately undercut the revelation by having nobody notice the difference. And the question of whether any of it, the voice, the orientation, the identity, is really Stewie or just the version of Stewie that gets the character through each episode without falling apart, remains exactly as open today as it was in 1999 when a small baby with a rugby ball-shaped head first appeared on a Fox network broadcast and said something no one around him seemed to fully hear. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stewie's constructed identity raises questions about what the show presents as real versus performed, and that line between real and performed sits at the center of one of the most structurally interesting theories connected to the show's own history. Because Family Guy was canceled in 2002, and the show that came back in 2005 may not have been the same show at all. Section 3, the show that came back was not the same show. Fox canceled Family Guy on May 15, 2002. The announcement came quietly, buried inside the network's annual unveiling of its upcoming fall lineup, which simply did not include the show. No dramatic statement. No farewell episode. The series had been moved around the schedule so many times during its second and third seasons, dropped into time slots against Friends, against Survivor, against whatever else the network thought might survive the competition better, that by the end the ratings had fallen far enough that continuing to air it made less financial sense than using the slot for something new. The show that had launched after the Super Bowl in January 1999 to an audience of 22 million viewers had, by the end of its third season, shrunk to a fraction of that number. Fox let it go. The cast and crew moved on. For a while, that appeared to be the complete story. What happened next is one of the stranger reversals in television history, and it matters to the fan theory sitting at the center of this section because understanding how the show came back is inseparable from understanding why the show that came back felt so different from the one that left. Cartoon Network purchased the rerun rights to Family Guy for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television described as basically nothing, a price so low it amounted to a network offloading a library it had no further use for. Adult Swim, Cartoon Network's late-night programming block, began airing the old episodes in April 2003. Within a very short time, Family Guy had become the most watched program on the entire block, drawing an audience that had not been there during its original broadcast run. The late-night cable audience of young adults who watched animated comedy well after midnight and told each other about it the way television audiences had started talking about things online rather than around the water cooler. At roughly the same time, Fox released the first 2 seasons on DVD. Sales reached 2.2 million copies, making the Family Guy set the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second highest-selling television DVD in history up to that point. The third season DVD release also cleared 1 million copies. Fox had essentially been sitting on a property that was enormously popular with exactly the audience it needed, and had simply never figured out how to connect those viewers to an airtime that worked for them. Once the connection happened through a different delivery method, the numbers made it impossible to ignore. In May 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes, marking what entertainment journalists noted at the time as the first revival of a television series driven primarily by DVD sales rather than by traditional ratings or network lobbying. Season 4 premiered on May 1, 2005, and drew 11.85 million viewers. The opening scene of that first new episode is itself a fan theory in miniature. Peter breaks the fourth wall and tells his family that their show has been canceled. He then proceeds to list, by name, every Fox series that had been commissioned and then canceled in the years between Family Guy's departure and return, a list that runs to 29 separate titles and includes Firefly, Undeclared, and a show called Greg the Bunny, among others. The joke lands because Peter is standing inside the show's own history and pointing at it directly, acknowledging that the audience understands what just happened and that the writers intend to acknowledge it rather than pretend the gap did not occur. The self-awareness is played for laughs, and the scene ends quickly, and the episode moves on into its plot. But that opening moment established something important without quite meaning to. The show knew it had been gone. The show knew it had come back. The show was not pretending otherwise. The problem, noticed by a significant number of longtime viewers over the seasons that followed, is that the version of the show that came back was not quite the same as the version that left. The differences were not immediately dramatic. The animation style stayed consistent. The main cast returned. The setting remained Quahog, but the texture of the show shifted in ways that accumulated across the new seasons into something that felt meaningfully different from the first 3. Characters who had been exaggerated but recognizably human in their motivations became caricatures of their earlier selves. Jokes that had previously been dark but grounded in something resembling emotional logic became darker and even further from any grounding. Peter, who in the early seasons had been a well-meaning, if deeply foolish father, who usually arrived at a lesson by the end of an episode, transformed across the post-revival seasons into something closer to a force of chaos, with no reliable interior life. The cruelty that had always been part of the show's comedy intensified, and then intensified again. This shift has been noticed and written about extensively, usually under the concept of Flanderization, a term borrowed from The Simpsons character Ned Flanders to describe what happens to a character when one personality trait gets exaggerated across seasons until it swallows every other quality the character once had. Family Guy post-cancellation has been cited as one of the more extreme examples of this process in animated comedy, with nearly every character in the main cast affected. But the fan theory this section is built around does not explain the shift as a natural consequence of a long-running show gradually losing its grip on who its characters were meant to be. It explains the shift as something structurally different, something built into the show's own rules, rather than a symptom of creative fatigue. The theory was posted by a Reddit user named HoHoSwackyQuest and argues that the pre-cancellation and post-cancellation versions of Family Guy are not the same universe. The show that aired from 1999 to 2002 and the show that returned in 2005 take place in parallel realities, separated by the gap, with the characters who came back being alternate versions of the people who left, rather than the same people continuing their lives across a break. The evidence the theory draws on begins with the Road to the Multiverse episode, which aired in the 8th season and established explicitly, within the show's own narrative, that the Family Guy universe contains infinite parallel realities accessible through technology Stewie has built. The multiverse is not a theoretical concept in this show's world. The show confirmed it exists. Once that confirmation is in place, a version of the theory that asks whether the post-cancellation show might occupy a different universe than the pre-cancellation show stops being a purely abstract idea and becomes something the show's own established rules technically permit. The second piece of evidence comes from the 10th season episode Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the events of the show's very first episode. The surface reading of this episode treats it as a straightforward time travel adventure, with the two characters visiting the past and interacting with their earlier selves. The theory reads it differently. The argument is that Brian and Stewie did not travel back in time. They traveled to a parallel universe, specifically the original universe the pre-cancellation show inhabited, which is why the episode's version of the pilot feels subtly but distinctly different in tone from the episodes surrounding it. On this reading, the time machine does not only move through time, it moves between universes, and the characters who return from the revival are already living in a different one than the characters who were there at the beginning. This reading does something interesting to the question of why the characters change so dramatically after the revival. If the post-cancellation characters are alternate universe versions of the originals, then the Flanderization is not a creative mistake, or a symptom of writing staff turnover, or the natural entropy of a long-running series. It is simply a reflection of the fact that these are different people, shaped by a different history in a different reality, who happen to look and sound like the family the audience originally fell in love with. The alternate Meg is crueler to her original counterpart's version of the character. The alternate Peter has no access to the warmth and self-awareness the original Peter occasionally reached for. The alternate Brian has lost the specific dignity the earlier character maintained through the indignities of being a talking dog in a human household. These are not the same characters declining. They are different characters who were never quite the people the audience thought they recognized. The original 3 seasons contain specific qualities that the revival never fully recovered. A season 1 episode called Death Has a Shadow establishes a Peter who can be genuinely foolish and genuinely loving within the same 22 minutes, whose relationship with Lois has real tenderness mixed into the comedy, and whose children are people he clearly cares about even when he handles that caring badly. The season 2 episode Da Bomb, which aired on December 26, 1999, and depicted a nuclear holocaust caused by the Y2K computer bug, is considered by many longtime viewers to be the peak of early Family Guy, a genuinely inventive piece of absurdist storytelling that operates completely differently from the cutaway heavy structure the post-revival show would rely on so heavily. The first 3 seasons are not uniformly excellent, but they have a consistent sense that the characters are people rather than platforms for jokes, that something is actually at stake even in the most absurd situations, and that the reset at the end of each episode is a formal convention rather than evidence that nothing the show depicts carries any weight at all. The post-revival show gradually shed those qualities across its later seasons until essentially none of them remained. Longtime viewers who had watched from the beginning described the experience of watching post-revival Family Guy as something like watching a tribute act performing songs they already knew, hitting the notes correctly but missing something that was harder to name than anything technical. The alternate universe theory gives that feeling a structural explanation rather than an aesthetic one. The tribute act is not failing to capture the original. The tribute act simply is a different band from a parallel reality that happens to play the same songs. Seth MacFarlane himself has described the 3-year hiatus as, in some ways, beneficial for the show, noting in interviews around the time of the revival that animated shows do not typically get breaks long enough for their writing staffs to fully recover between seasons, and that the gap gave everyone involved a chance to approach the material with something resembling fresh eyes. He also acknowledged that the writing team's goal for the return was to keep the show exactly as it had been before, to resist the temptation to update or reimagine the family in ways that would signal to the audience that something had changed. The intention, in MacFarlane's own description, was continuity. The show that arrived back on Fox in May 2005 was meant to feel like it had never left. The theory argues it did not quite manage that, and the evidence it draws on from the text of the show itself is specific enough to take seriously even without accepting the multiverse framing entirely. The character trajectories after the revival diverged sharply enough from where they were heading in the original run that the simplest explanation, creative drift compounded over time, does not fully account for the scale of the difference. Peter's early warmth does not erode gradually in the way natural flanderization typically works. It is largely gone by the time the 4th season is well underway. Meg's mistreatment, which existed in milder form in the original run, accelerates into something qualitatively different almost immediately after the revival. Brian's intelligence, which gave the character a specific kind of dignity in the early seasons, begins the long decline that would eventually see him described in fan discussions as having become a character who barely resembles his original self by the time the later seasons arrived. The multiverse episode also contains a small detail that the theory's supporters point to as the most internally consistent piece of evidence. When Stewie and Brian travel between realities in Road to the Multiverse, they visit versions of their world that are structurally similar but fundamentally different in their details, universes where the same people live different lives shaped by different histories. The episode treats these alternate versions as real, as genuinely existing places with their own logic and their own inhabitants, not as fantasies or errors, but as legitimate parallel realities. The show that confirmed all of this is running inside a universe that its own internal rules describe as one of many. The theory simply asks whether the show that left in 2002 and the show that came back in 2005 might be two of those many, sitting side by side across a gap the revival did not quite close. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The idea that the revival created a different version of the family raises questions about what exactly was lost in the gap, and the character those questions attach to most persistently is not Peter or Stewie or even Brian. The character whose change across the show's history has generated the most sustained and complicated discussion among fans is the one who was supposed to be ordinary, and whose ordinariness turned out to be one of the strangest things the show ever produced. Section 4. The character the show could not figure out, Megan Griffin, appeared in the very first episode of Family Guy in January 1999, voiced by an actress named Lacey Chabert, and she was a recognizable type, the embarrassed teenage daughter, mortified by her parents, desperate for social acceptance, defined mostly by what she wanted rather than what she had, orbiting the Griffin family chaos without contributing much of it herself. Chabert left the role before the second season ended, citing school commitments and her work on Party of Five, and Mila Kunis took over the voice starting with the 3rd episode of season 2. Most viewers did not notice the change immediately. Meg was not yet the character she would become. She was still a placeholder, a structural necessity the show needed to complete the family without having yet figured out what to do with her once the family was complete. What happened to Meg Griffin across the seasons that followed is one of the more uncomfortable stories in the history of animated television, not because of what the character experienced within the show, though that is genuinely extreme, but because of why it happened, which turns out to have a much simpler and more honest explanation than most of the fan theories built around it. Seth MacFarlane has stated in interviews that his writing team was predominantly male, and that the predominantly male writing staff simply could not figure out how to write a teenage girl in a way that generated consistent comedy. The character as originally conceived, a slightly whiny, socially anxious high schooler with normal teenage concerns about popularity and boys, was not producing material anyone found funny. Rather than solving that problem by writing the character differently or hiring writers who could bring a different perspective to her, the team took the path of least resistance. They made Meg the target. The abuse that followed was gradual at first and then accelerating. Peter began insulting her appearance. The rest of the family joined in. Classmates at school who barely knew her dismissed her on sight. Strangers encountered in the street expressed revulsion at her presence. The show built a running architecture of contempt around a character who had done nothing to earn it, and then kept adding floors to that architecture with each new season, testing how far the joke could be pushed before it stopped landing. The answer, based on the show's own behavior, appeared to be that there was no ceiling. The cruelty could always be escalated. A new indignity could always be found. Peter's treatment of Meg Meg in particular shifted from the careless thoughtlessness of an inattentive parent into something that occasionally resembled deliberate sadism, with specific episodes showing him targeting her with a focus that went well beyond the scattershot stupidity he applied to everything else in his life. The character's original voice actress Lacey Chabert left before any of this was in place. Mila Kunis, who inherited the role and has voiced Meg across nearly the entire run of the show, has described the character in interviews with a kind of fond exasperation, comparing Meg's situation to that of a middle child in permanent awkward adolescence, someone caught between phases and never quite arriving at the next one. Kunis has described the experience of playing a character who is treated so badly by the people around her as, in her own words, funny rather than disturbing, framing the extreme cruelty as a comedic formula the show found and committed to, rather than as something requiring deeper examination. That framing is honest about what the show was doing. It is less comfortable when examined from the outside, because the formula that was found and committed to involved taking the one female character in the main family and making her the object of sustained, escalating mistreatment, specifically because the writing staff lacked the tools to do anything else with her. The fan theories that accumulated around Meg across the show's run tried to impose a structure on this that the actual writing decisions did not possess. The most widespread of these reads Meg's mistreatment as a function of Peter's grief hallucination, which was covered in detail in the first section of this video. In that reading, Meg is treated badly because the Peter imagining her blames her for the deaths that destroyed his real family, and his love for her coexists with his resentment in a way that produces the specific mixture of cruelty and occasional tenderness the show displays. That theory works as a reading of the finished product. It does not work as a description of the creative decision, which was simply that a male-dominated writing room could not write teenage girl drama and defaulted to making her a target instead. A second and more widely discussed theory does not reach for a hidden tragic explanation at all. It works directly from the surface of the show, and it derives most of its force from a single episode that aired in October 2011 in the show's 10th season. The episode is called Seahorse Seashell Party, and it aired as part of a crossover event with American Dad and The Cleveland Show, all three shows set during the same hurricane hitting their respective locations simultaneously. The Family Guy portion of the event is largely a bottle episode, the Griffins trapped inside their house while the storm passes, with Brian consuming psychedelic mushrooms in one subplot, and the main storyline building towards something the show had been deferring for years. Meg snaps. After another round of unprovoked abuse from her family, she loses her composure entirely and addresses each family member in turn, delivering what the episode presents as an honest accounting of everything that is wrong with each of them. Her speech to Lois is the sharpest, walking through a history of Lois's own past behavior that the show had documented across its seasons, and Lois breaks down crying under the weight of it. Her address to Peter eventually lands hard enough that Peter retreats upstairs in tears, something the show had not previously allowed to happen. Chris leaves in shame. For a brief moment, the episode appears to be doing something genuinely unusual for Family Guy, allowing a character who had been mistreated across hundreds of episodes to finally receive some form of acknowledgement that the mistreatment had been real and had a cost. The resolution of the episode is the piece that generated the most discussion among critics and fans afterward, and that discussion is central to the theory this section is built around. Brian, watching what just happened, tells Meg that she did the right thing by standing up for herself. Meg sits quietly and thinks about what she just observed. What she observed was that the moment she removed herself as the family's target, they immediately turned on each other. The dysfunction that had been directed at her with such reliable consistency suddenly having nowhere to go and finding the nearest available surface instead. Meg reaches a conclusion that the episode presents, somewhat uneasily, as her arriving at wisdom. She decides that her role in the family is to serve as a lightning rod, to absorb the dysfunction that would otherwise tear the Griffins apart. She goes back to each family member and apologizes, taking responsibility for the confrontation, restoring the order that her honesty had briefly disturbed, and returning voluntarily to the position she had just escaped. The reaction from critics was sharp and largely negative, focused specifically on this resolution. Kevin McFarland, reviewing the episode for the AV Club, gave it a D+, and wrote that the show had spent years joining the fan chorus of hatred directed at Meg, rather than finding a way to make her genuinely funny or valued, and that one episode of forced justification for that treatment did not change anything. The deeper criticism embedded in his review was structural. The lightning rod resolution does not actually change Meg's situation. It provides a narrative explanation for why her situation will remain exactly as it has always been, and then frames Meg's acceptance of that situation as a form of maturity rather than a form of defeat. She is not liberated by the episode. She is given a reason to stay where she was, dressed up to look like growth. The fan theory built around this lightning rod idea takes the episode's internal logic seriously and asks what it means for the show as a whole if Meg's function is genuinely structural, rather than simply the result of lazy writing. Under this reading, every character in the Griffin family carries a level of dysfunction that, if left without an outlet, would make the household impossible to sustain as a comedic premise. Peter's cruelty and irresponsibility would destroy his marriage if Lois directed all of her frustration back at him without a release valve. Lois's own history, which the show has documented across many episodes in considerable detail, would make her a far less sympathetic character if it were regularly held up to examination. Chris's passivity and disconnection from consequences would require the show to address it as a problem if there were no one further down the family hierarchy absorbing the weight of what goes wrong. Stewie's genuine malevolence, softened considerably since the early seasons but never entirely gone, would require moral accounting if no one in the house were available to redirect attention away from it. Meg absorbs all of this. She takes the cruelty that would otherwise land on the marriage, on the parent-child relationships, on the friendships, and she redirects it away from anything that would damage the show's central comedy engine. She keeps the Griffins functional as a family precisely by being the designated point where the family's dysfunction accumulates and then drains away, episode after episode, without accumulating consequences. The lightning rod in this reading is not just what Meg calls herself in the episode. It is a structural description of how the show's writing actually works, with Meg functioning as a narrative pressure valve rather than a fully realized character. This reading also explains something specific about the episodes in which Meg is treated better or given her own storyline, which tend to generate a distinctive feeling of wrongness among regular viewers, as though the show is briefly operating against its own internal rules. An episode called Dial Meg for Murder, in which Meg goes to prison and returns transformed into someone capable of physical dominance and genuine menace, creates a comedic premise precisely by inverting the expected hierarchy. Meg, as someone to be feared, is funny specifically because the audience's entire existing framework for who Meg is makes the inversion surprising. But the show cannot sustain the inversion beyond a single episode, because a Meg who is not functioning as the lightning rod creates a structural problem the other characters cannot accommodate. The episode ends and the hierarchy restores itself because the hierarchy is load-bearing in a way the show rarely acknowledges directly. The real writing history behind Meg's treatment, which MacFarlane has described openly, adds a layer to the theory that the episode itself does not quite reach. The lightning rod explanation is what the show eventually produced to justify a creative decision that was not originally made for any structural reason. The original decision was simply that the writing team did not know how to write her. The justification arrived later, constructed backward from a situation that had already developed into something the show needed to explain, rather than simply change. Seahorse Seashell Party is not the show's writers making a deliberate artistic statement about how abusive family systems function. It is the show's writers finding the most elegant available explanation for why things are the way they are, and then presenting that explanation as a kind of wisdom Meg arrives at through suffering. This distinction matters because it separates what the episode says from what the episode does. It says that Meg's role is necessary, and that her acceptance of it demonstrates a maturity her family lacks. What it does is settle the question of whether the mistreatment will stop, and the answer it gives is no, dressed in the language of meaningful choice. Critics like MacFarlane notice this gap immediately. The episode acknowledges that the treatment has been real. It acknowledges that it has had a cost, and then it reconstructs exactly the conditions that make the treatment both possible and permanent, with Meg's own consent framed as her arriving at an understanding her family cannot reach. Later seasons gradually softened the most extreme instances of the abuse, with the show's own sources noting that the writing staff became more diverse over time and that the change in the room's composition was reflected in how the character was handled. By around season 20, the systematic cruelty had largely disappeared from the show's treatment of Meg, replaced by something closer to ordinary family dysfunction without the deliberate targeting that had defined her role for over a decade. What the lightning rod theory ultimately reveals about Family Guy is something that the show itself demonstrated accidentally through the Seahorse Seashell Party episode. A show can be fully aware of what it is doing to a character and still be unable to change it, because the thing it is doing to the character is doing something necessary for the show's structure. The comedy engine needs a lightning rod to keep running. Acknowledging that need openly, as the episode does not discharge the need. It simply names it, and then the episode ends, and the next one begins, and Meg is still standing at the same address on Spooner Street, waiting for the next round of weather the family needs somewhere to send. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg's role as a structural necessity raises questions about how deliberately the show has understood its own mechanics across its long run, and that question of deliberateness becomes even stranger when applied to the character who has changed the most visibly since the beginning, the one who started as the show's moral compass and ended up somewhere no one quite intended him to go. Section 5. The Dog Who Lost Himself. Brian Griffin was introduced as a joke about a dog who acted like a man, Brian, and for a long time that was enough. He ordered martinis, he read literary fiction, he sat at the kitchen table and pointed out, with the measured calm of someone who had already accepted that nothing around him would ever make complete sense, exactly what was wrong with whatever Peter had just decided to do. The comedy of Brian in the early seasons came from the gap between what he was, a Labrador mix living in a suburban Rhode Island house, and how he carried himself, which was with the specific kind of dignity that belongs to someone who has read more books than the people he lives with and would like them to know it without having to say so directly. He was not a cartoon dog who occasionally said funny things. He was a functioning adult who happened to be a dog, and the show treated that premise with enough internal consistency that it felt earned rather than arbitrary. The theory that sits at the center of this section is not about who Brian was in the early seasons. It is about what happened to him afterward, and why the explanation most viewers reach for, that the writers gradually lost interest in maintaining the character's consistency and allowed him to drift, does not quite account for the specific shape of the decline. The theory was posted by a Reddit user named Grandmaster Sexay, and argues that Brian's personality change across the show's run is not a writing failure at all. It is an accurate depiction of what progressive alcoholism and substance abuse do to a person's brain over time. The comedy of Brian's deterioration, viewed through this lens, is not a character being badly written. It is a character being accurately written in a way the show never formally identified as such. The evidence the theory builds on starts with what Brian's relationship to alcohol actually looks like in the early seasons compared to the later ones. In the first few seasons, Brian drinks, but the drinking is framed as a character detail rather than a defining trait. He orders a martini the way a certain kind of intellectual orders a martini, as a statement about taste rather than a compulsion. The drinking is present, it is part of who he is, but it sits alongside everything else he is rather than crowding those other things out. He is still curious. He is still capable of sustained thought. He still functions as the show's most reliable voice of reason in situations where reason is the rarest commodity available. The alcohol is a personality accessory in the early seasons, the kind of detail that communicates something about a character without being the whole story. What happens across the seasons that follow is a slow replacement of everything Brian was with a narrower and progressively less flattering version of the same person. The sophistication that distinguished him from the beginning erodes into a kind of performed sophistication, a pantomime of the character he used to actually be, still claiming to read serious literature and hold considered opinions but displaying less and less capacity for either. His relationships with women, which in the early seasons carried a specific kind of sadness rooted in genuine longing for connection he could not quite achieve, shifted into a pattern of pursuing much younger and significantly less intelligent partners in a way that registered less as loneliness and more as the ego management of someone whose self-image has decoupled from any honest accounting of who he actually is. His writing, which was always more aspiration than achievement even in the early seasons, became a punchline the show returned to with increasing frequency, a character insisting on a creative identity that the show around him treated as evidence of delusion. The theory argues that this trajectory follows the actual documented pattern of alcohol's effect on the brain with more fidelity than any deliberate writing choice would have produced by accident. Prolonged heavy drinking does specific things to cognitive function that are visible in Brian's character arc if the arc is read as a record of neurological change rather than narrative drift. Decision-making capacity degrades. The ability to accurately assess one's own behavior relative to an honest standard weakens. Social judgment becomes impaired in ways the person experiencing the impairment cannot fully perceive, leading to behavior that registers to outside observers as increasingly self-destructive or socially inappropriate, while feeling to the person themselves as perfectly reasonable. The gap between Brian's self-perception and the reality of how he is functioning in the world grows wider with each season, and the show consistently plays that gap for comedy without ever framing it as what it actually is. The dog brain detail is one the theory specifically addresses, and it is worth sitting with because it adds a layer of biological plausibility that makes the argument harder to dismiss as pure pattern matching. Dog brains are significantly smaller than human brains. The show treats Brian as functionally human in terms of his cognitive capacity, which is part of the initial premise, but the theory suggests that the same amount of alcohol and drug exposure that might produce moderate cognitive decline in a human brain would produce more severe and more rapid decline in a brain the size of a dog's. Brian's experiences with psychedelics and other substances across the show's run are numerous, and several of them are depicted as intense to a degree that would suggest lasting neurological effects, rather than the kind of recreational experience that passes cleanly. The theory reads these episodes not as self-contained comedic premises, but as a cumulative record of damage that the show is accurately depicting without knowing that it is doing so. This reading of the character gains additional support from one specific and well-documented piece of Brian's early history. A third season episode explored Brian's difficulty maintaining a relationship with a woman who matched his actual intellectual level, depicting his frustration at his own tendency to pursue partners who were less challenging rather than those who would genuinely engage him as an equal. The episode framed this as a character flaw Brian was aware of and troubled by, something he wanted to change and was actively working against. This is a version of Brian who has enough self-awareness to identify his own patterns and enough honesty to find those patterns uncomfortable. The later Brian, the one the theory reads as demonstrating the effects of prolonged substance use, no longer has access to that level of self-awareness. He pursues considerably younger and less intellectually developed partners without apparent discomfort, seeming to genuinely believe that the pursuit reflects well on him rather than representing exactly the pattern the earlier version of himself found disturbing. The show itself occasionally gestures toward acknowledging Brian's decline, usually through jokes at his expense that the show delivers without committing to the acknowledgement fully. Other characters point out that his novel has been unfinished for years. They question whether his political opinions are as sophisticated as he believes them to be. Stewie, whose relationship with Brian is the most intimate and most honest in the show, has delivered some of the sharpest assessments of who Brian has become, in moments that feel less like comedy setups and more like an accurate inventory of a friendship deteriorating under the weight of one person's slow disappearance from themselves. These moments never lead anywhere. They arrive, deliver their observation, and the show moves on without letting the observation accumulate into a storyline. The theory argues that this refusal to follow through on what the show occasionally sees clearly is itself consistent with how alcohol is handled in the show's world, present and obvious, and never quite treated as the explanation it might actually be. Brian's relationship with Stewie is the most interesting piece of this whole picture precisely because it is the one relationship in the show that resisted the decline longest. The Road to episodes, the series of adventure stories that placed Brian and Stewie in various settings across the show's history, consistently produced the most critically and fan-favorably received material in the show's post-revival run. These episodes work in part because they remove Brian from the domestic context in which his decline is most visible and place him inside a structure that requires him to function at something closer to his earlier capacity. Away from the Quahog living room, away from the drunken clam, away from the specific social environment in which his worst habits are most fully expressed, Brian in the Road to episodes retains more of what made him interesting in the first place. The friendship with Stewie, which requires mutual engagement and genuine affection to generate the specific comedy those episodes depend on, brings out qualities in Brian that the regular show has largely stopped giving him room to display. This is also where the theory intersects with something worth examining about how the show has historically used Brian as a vehicle for Seth MacFarlane's own political and cultural opinions. The early seasons, Brian expressed considered views that the show presented as the considered views of an intelligent character. The later seasons, Brian expresses those same kinds of views with a self-righteousness that the show clearly intends to mock, having positioned the character as someone who mistakes the performance of sophistication for the real thing. Critics of the show have pointed out that this shift made Brian considerably less likable without making him more interesting, producing a character who is easy to find irritating but harder to find genuinely funny in the way the early Brian had been. The theory offers a different reading of this same trajectory. A person whose cognitive function is being progressively impaired by substance use does not become stupid in a uniform way. They often retain the vocabulary and the conversational habits of who they were while losing the precision and honesty that made those habits meaningful. The later Brian still sounds like the earlier Brian in the sense that he uses the same words and gestures toward the same kinds of opinions. He simply does so with less actual substance behind any of it, which is exactly the shape that decline takes when it moves through someone who built their entire identity around seeming intelligent rather than simply being intelligent. Brian's death in November 2013, which will be covered in more detail in a later section of this video, fits the theory in an unexpected way. The episode in which he dies removes him from the show for a period that covers 3 episodes before Stewie travels back in time to prevent the accident. The replacement dog brought in during his absence, a character named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, who was best known for his work on The Sopranos, is in almost every measurable way the opposite of Brian. Vinny is emotionally direct, unconcerned with appearing sophisticated, honest about his limitations, and genuinely warm towards Stewie in a way that does not require him to maintain any particular self-image. The contrast between Vinny and Brian, played entirely for the comedy of mismatched replacement, also functions as a quiet before and after portrait of what Brian might have been if the decades of drinking had not gradually replaced the interior of the character with something hollowed out. The theory never claims that the show wrote Brian's decline intentionally as a depiction of alcoholism. That claim would require evidence of deliberate craft that is not present in the available record of how the character was written across the seasons. What the theory claims is narrower and more interesting. It argues that the decline the show produced through ordinary creative drift, the natural entropy of a long-running show gradually loses losing its grip on who a character was supposed to be, happens to map with unusual accuracy onto the documented progression of alcohol-related cognitive change. The show did not mean to depict this. The theory argues that it depicted it anyway, that the accidental record of a character being slowly written into a smaller version of himself by a writer's room that stopped asking what Brian was really about turns out to resemble, almost point for point, the record a real person's history would produce under similar circumstances. This is the kind of theory that functions differently from the ones built around hidden tragedy or alternate universes, because it does not require any invisible backstory or structural reframing to work. Every piece of evidence it draws on is visible in the broadcast episodes themselves. The martinis are there from the first season. The drug episodes are there across the middle seasons. The declining self-awareness is there in the later seasons. The gap between Brian's stated identity and the character the show actually presents grows measurably across the run, in a direction and at a pace that the theory argues is too specific to be purely accidental. Whether or not the writers intended any of it, the show produced a portrait of someone who began as one kind of person and ended up as a recognizably different kind, shaped by habits that the show treated as character details rather than as forces that actually change people, in exactly the ways that those forces actually change people. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's gradual disappearance from himself across the show's long run is one kind of loss, a slow erosion visible only in retrospect. A different and far more sudden kind of loss arrived in November 2013, when the show killed Brian Griffin outright, and the reaction from the audience revealed something about the relationship between a television show and the people who watch it that the writers admitted they had not anticipated. Section 6. The 3 weeks Family Guy killed its dog. Sunday night, November 24th, 2013. An episode of Family Guy called Life of Brian aired on Fox. In the opening, Brian and Stewie find a street hockey net near a junkyard and bring it home. They set it up in the road outside the house. Stewie goes back inside to get his knee pads. While Stewie is inside, a car comes around the corner and strikes Brian at full speed. The scene does not cut away. The show stays with it. Brian is taken to a veterinarian's office, and the family gathers around him. He tells them he loves them, he dies. The family holds a funeral. A month later, by the episode's internal timeline, the Griffins adopt a new dog named Vinny, and the episode ends with Vinny settling into the household as though Brian had always been replaceable. Eric Thurm, reviewing the episode for the AV Club the same night it aired, gave it an A- and wrote that Brian's death scene was actually pretty poignant, describing it as coming as close as Family Guy ever gets to genuinely moving. He called the episode surprisingly effective at dealing with the sudden death of a main character. This was not a dismissive review. It was a critic acknowledging that a show better known for refusing emotional weight had managed to generate some, and that the specific way it did so, by committing to the loss rather than undercutting it immediately with a joke, gave the episode a quality the show had rarely reached for in its post-revival years. The audience's response began within hours of the broadcast ending, and it was not the response the writers had prepared for. A petition appeared on Change.org that same night, addressed to Seth MacFarlane and the Fox Broadcasting Company, asking for Brian Griffin to be brought back to the show. The petition described Brian as an important part of the viewing experience, someone who added a witty and sophisticated element that Family Guy and its audience would lose without him. Within hours of going live, the petition had already collected thousands of signatures, making it one of the fastest-growing entertainment-related petitions the site had ever hosted. The signatures kept accumulating over the following days, accompanied by an outpouring of social media posts, fan videos, and written tributes that treated Brian Griffin's death with a seriousness that surprised even the people who spent their professional lives thinking about how audiences responded to television. A fan got a tattoo. This detail, reported at the time, deserves a moment of its own attention because it communicates something about the speed and intensity of the reaction that a petition signature count cannot quite capture. Someone watched an episode of an animated comedy on a Sunday night, felt the loss of a fictional dog strongly enough to want to mark it permanently on their body, and did so before the situation resolved, before Brian came back, before the show revealed whether the death was meant to be permanent or not. The tattoo was a real commitment made in response to a cartoon character's death, and it was made fast enough that no amount of internet skepticism about whether the show would really follow through could slow it down. Seth MacFarlane spoke about the reaction in interviews shortly afterward, and his response is worth examining carefully because of what it reveals about the gap between what the writers intended and what actually happened. MacFarlane said the team had been surprised by how angry people got, describing it as surprising in a good way because it proved that viewers still cared enough about the character to feel that strongly. He added that they had expected some response, had designed the episode specifically to create a stir, but that the rage was not something anyone had calculated for. He also framed the death in terms of what he described as its designed purpose, saying the episode had done what it was meant to do by reminding the audience that the show was still a place where anything could happen, even after years of episodes built on a foundation of reset and consequence-free chaos. Writer Steve Callahan told the entertainment press at the time that the idea had been pitched in the writer's room and caught fire as a concept, with the team getting excited about how the absence of Brian would affect the family dynamics and the other characters. The language Callahan used was the language of creative opportunity, of a room full of writers finding a premise that opened up new possibilities and running toward it. What the room clearly did not fully model, before the episode aired, was the depth of the audience's relationship with the specific character being removed. Brian had been in the show since its very first episode in January 1999. He was one of the four voices Seth MacFarlane provided for the regular cast. He had been present in every episode across 11 seasons. Whatever the later seasons had done to his character, the accumulated weight of that history meant that the audience's relationship with him was not the relationship of viewers watching a replaceable supporting player. It was the relationship of an audience with someone they had been watching, week after week, for the better part of 15 years. Vinny, the replacement dog introduced in the same episode, was voiced by Tony Sirico, best known to American audiences as Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos. The casting choice was designed to create maximum contrast with Brian, placing a street-smart, emotionally direct, openly affectionate character in the space that a sophisticated, somewhat emotionally guarded character had occupied. Vinny worked as a comedic premise in the limited time he was given. He was not without warmth, and Stewie's relationship with him across the episode following Brian's death had a specific tenderness that the show handled with more care than it often extended to its emotional moments. But the audience did not want Vinny. The audience made this clear immediately and continuously across the weeks between Brian's death and whatever would come next. A hoax website appeared during this period, featuring a countdown clock and imagery suggesting an announcement was coming from Brian Griffin himself. Multiple media outlets initially reported the site as genuine, treating the countdown as a real signal from Fox, or from the production team, about Brian's future. It turned out to be a fan-created site designed to build pressure for the character's return, and Fox confirmed its unofficial status before the countdown reached 0. The site was then repurposed as a formal petition platform, adding another stream of signatures to the ongoing demand for the character's resurrection. The existence of the hoax site, and the speed with which news organizations initially accepted it as genuine, says something about how dramatically the conversation around the episode had grown in the weeks following the broadcast. Brian returned on December 15, 2013, in a Christmas episode. Stewie, whose time machine had been destroyed earlier in the season as a plot point in the episode that killed Brian, had been unable to use it to go back and prevent the accident immediately. In the Christmas episode, a future version of Stewie travels back to give the present-day Stewie a time machine component he needs, and Stewie uses it to return to the moment just before Brian was struck by the car and pull him out of the road. Brian was dead for a total of 3 episodes. Vinny was subsequently written out, though the show later gave him a gentle send-off in a season 15 episode that acknowledged his time with the family without pretending it had been more significant than it was. MacFarlane's description of the reaction as surprising in a good way opens up the more interesting analytical questions sitting underneath the surface of this entire story. The death was designed to demonstrate that the show could still surprise people, that the reset button was not a guarantee, that anything could happen. The resurrection was driven, at least in part, by how strongly the audience rejected the demonstration. What the sequence of events actually demonstrated was almost the opposite of what it was designed to show. It demonstrated that the audience had a relationship with Brian Griffin that the show itself did not fully understand until the moment it tried to remove him. And it demonstrated that Family Guy, which had spent years building a comedic identity around the idea that nothing it depicted carried real consequences, had accidentally produced one character whose loss carried enough weight that the audience refused to accept it. This is where the fan theories connected to Brian's death become more interesting than the simple question of whether he was ever meant to stay dead. One theory that circulated widely in the weeks between the death and the resurrection focused on Stewie specifically, arguing that Stewie's destruction of the time machine in the Life of Brian episode was not an accident or an unrelated plot detail. The theory read it as deliberate, suggesting that Stewie destroyed the machine knowing that Brian was going to be hit by a car, either because he had already seen the future or because he had engineered the situation, and that his destruction of the machine was not carelessness but an act intended to make Brian's death permanent. The evidence the theory drew on was the specific timing. The machine was destroyed in the same episode in which Brian died, removing the most obvious mechanism for reversal at exactly the moment a reversal would be most needed. This theory reads Stewie's grief across the following episode as either genuine, in which case the destruction was accidental and his inability to save Brian was simply tragic, or performed, in which case Stewie had reasons for wanting Brian gone that the show never made explicit. Those who argued for the deliberate reading pointed to the complexity of Stewie and Brian's friendship across the show's history, a relationship that was genuine and deep but also frequently imbalanced, with Stewie expressing feelings for Brian across many episodes that Brian did not always return with equivalent equivalent directness. The theory suggested that someone capable of building a time machine and a death ray before his second birthday would not accidentally destroy his most powerful tool at the least convenient possible moment. The timing, under this reading, was the evidence. Coincidences do not typically run in that specific a direction. The theory did not survive the Christmas episode cleanly, since the resurrection framed Stewie's desire to save Brian as the episode's entire emotional engine, presenting his grief as genuine and his efforts to repair the time machine as the actions of someone who had not engineered the loss. But the theory's appeal before the resurrection is worth examining because it reveals what the audience was doing in the 3 weeks between episodes, which was actively constructing narratives that could account for what had happened in terms that went beyond the show simply deciding to kill a character for shock value and a ratings bump. Audiences building theories in response to a fictional death is not unusual. What was unusual about this particular case was the intensity of the theoretical activity and the speed with which it generated, evidence that the emotional investment in the character was high enough to produce creative responses rather than simply passive grief. The 3 weeks of Brian Griffin's death also produced a secondary conversation about what the show owed its audience in terms of honoring the history it had built. Critics who had been following the show for years noted that Family Guy had spent much of its post-revival run explicitly signaling that nothing it did carried real stakes, that the reset button was always available, that characters could survive anything the plot required them to survive. Brian's death seemed, in the days immediately following the episode, like an exception to that rule, a genuine break from the show's own established conventions. His resurrection 3 episodes later confirmed that the exception was temporary, that the reset button existed even for the most apparently permanent events, and that the show's relationship to consequence was exactly as loose as its post-revival decade had suggested. What remained after the resurrection, once the immediate relief among fans who wanted Brian back had settled, was a more complicated feeling among the portion of the audience that had found the death meaningful. The 3 weeks in which Brian was gone had, for those viewers, produced something genuine. The grief was real, even if the death was fictional. The theories were real, constructed with care and investment. The petition and the tattoo and the hoax website were all real responses to a real emotional experience triggered by a cartoon. The resurrection did not erase those 3 weeks. It simply revealed that the show had not understood what those 3 weeks meant when it made the decision to end them. McFarlane's description of being surprised by the rage carries a specific kind of irony once the whole sequence is visible from beginning to end. The show that killed Brian to prove it could still surprise people was genuinely surprised by how much its audience loved the character it had been gradually writing into a smaller version of himself for years. The decline the previous section traced through the lens of Brian's drinking was not visible enough to the audience in real time to diminish the attachment. They loved the Brian they had always known, carried forward through seasons of diminished writing, and when the show removed him, they responded in a way that made the attachment unmistakable. The writers learned, 3 weeks before Christmas 2013, that they had made something they did not fully understand, and they brought it back before the lesson had time to fully settle. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's death and return settled one question about the show's relationship to consequence, while leaving a larger one open. The question of what the audience hears when a character speaks, and what the show itself intends to be heard, is at the center of the most structurally unusual theory in the show's entire fan theory canon. One that does not begin with a character dying, but with a baby who may or may not be the only person in the room who is entirely real. Section 7, the show that only one person can see. Somewhere in the middle of a typical Family Guy episode, Stewie delivers a long and elaborate speech directly to another character in the room. The speech is specific, often funny, sometimes genuinely sharp, built on the assumption that language is the most powerful tool available to someone who cannot yet walk reliably or operate a doorknob without assistance. And then the character Stewie was speaking to responds to something entirely different, or walks away, or looks through him as though the words were never spoken at all. The joke lands easily. The audience accepts it as a running gag about a baby whose family does not take him seriously. The scene moves on. Nobody in the writer's room, based on any available evidence, sat down and asked whether the inconsistency was pointing at something larger than a comedic premise about an unheard child. A Reddit user named iFornication asked that question and arrived at an answer that reframes the entire show rather than explaining a single joke. The theory, which has circulated across fan communities since it was first posted and has been discussed in entertainment publications including Screen Rant, argues that Family Guy is not being told from a neutral camera position above Quahog, Rhode Island. It is being told from inside Stewie Griffin's perception of the world. Everything the audience sees, every cutaway, every impossible event, every character behavior that does not quite add up, is filtered through the consciousness of a 1-year-old baby making sense of a reality reality that is too large and too complicated for someone his age to process accurately. The show is not a documentary about a family. It is the interior experience of the smallest and least powerful member of that family, rendered as best a baby's mind can manage. The theory's most immediately useful piece of evidence is the one it was designed to solve, which is the question of who can hear Stewie speak. Seth MacFarlane addressed this question publicly on multiple occasions, giving slightly different answers depending on when he was asked. At one point, he stated that everyone in the show can understand Stewie perfectly, but simply does not take him seriously because he is a baby. At a San Diego Comic-Con panel in 2011, he offered a more specific breakdown, saying that Brian always understands Stewie, Chris understands him occasionally, and that Peter, Lois, and Meg do not understand him as a rule, while acknowledging that the writers break these guidelines whenever a joke requires it. The show's 19th season premiere attempted to resolve the question by having Stewie's first publicly understood word break through at a moment of intense emotion, with Stewie concluding afterward that strong feeling is what allows him to be heard. None of these explanations fully account for every scene in the show's history. Each one creates new inconsistencies while resolving old ones. The perspective theory resolves the inconsistency at a different level by changing the question. Under this reading, the question is not who in Quahog can hear Stewie speak, because Quahog is not a place with independent inhabitants making consistent choices. Quahog is what Stewie perceives Quahog to be, rendered with a baby's perceptual tools and emotional logic. The characters who understand Stewie in the show are not characters who have decided to pay attention to him. They are the people in Stewie's real life whom he experiences as genuinely present, as tuned in, as available to him in the way that matters to a very young child. Brian understands Stewie in every scene because the actual dog in the Griffin household is the living creature Stewie feels most consistently connected to, the one whose attention he experiences as reliable. A baby who loves a dog would experience the dog as something that always listens, always responds, always stays nearby. That experience of the dog gets rendered in the show as Brian always understanding what Stewie says, because from inside a baby's perception, that is simply the truth of their relationship. Peter and Lois's inconsistency, which is the most frequently noticed problem in the entire hearing question, fits this framework with a specificity that the official explanations cannot quite match. A baby's experience of parental availability is not a fixed fact. It is something that changes from moment to moment, based on what the parents are doing, how distracted they are, how present they feel to a child who cannot yet understand the adult world well enough to know why attention comes and goes. When Lois seems to hear Stewie clearly in one scene and fails to register him in the next, the perspective theory reads that as an accurate record of how available Lois has felt to Stewie across different moments. Her attention is inconsistent because parental attention is inconsistent, and the show being filtered through a baby's perception would record that inconsistency directly, rather than smoothing it into a rule. The theory's next piece of evidence moves from who hears Stewie to why everything in the show is so extreme. The violence that characters survive without consequence. The cutaway gags that bear no relationship to the events surrounding them. The physics-defying situations that resolve cleanly by the next scene. The characters who behave in ways that no adult in the real world would recognize as normal. The perspective theory reads all of this as what happens when a baby, working with severely limited knowledge of how the world actually functions, tries to make sense of the things happening around it. Babies do not have access to the full context of adult life. They observe without understanding the mechanisms behind what they observe. They register emotional intensity without being able to accurately assess what is causing it. They experience the people around them as far more powerful and far more capable of extreme behavior than those people actually are, because babies have no framework for accurately calibrating what adults can and cannot do. Peter Griffin in this reading is not a badly written character who became more cartoonishly destructive as the seasons progressed. He is a baby's rendering of a large, loud, physically overwhelming father whose behavior is frequently confusing and occasionally frightening, and whose impact on the household seems out of proportion to anything the baby can understand as a cause. Peter's physics-defying resilience, his ability to survive injuries that should be fatal, his capacity to cause chaos on a scale that no actual person could produce without consequence, are all features of how a baby would render a large and unpredictable adult rather than features of a realistic character. A baby does not know the limits of what a person can do. It only knows the emotional magnitude of what it experiences, and the show translates that emotional magnitude directly into narrative reality. Lois, under this same reading, becomes the baby's rendering of the primary caregiver, which is a figure of enormous and somewhat terrifying power in a baby's life. Lois is competent in ways that the other adults in the show frequently are not, possessed of a kind of baseline functional authority that keeps the household from completely disintegrating despite everything Peter does to it. This is not idealization. The show also gives Lois flaws and a history of questionable behavior that it returns to regularly across its run. A baby's experience of the primary caregiver is not idealized either. It is simply large, central, and complicated, the figure around whom the emotional emotional life of the household organizes itself, whether the baby understands the specifics or not. Lois in the show is the organizing center of the Griffin family in exactly this way, present and powerful, even when her behavior is not easy to admire. Stewie's relationship with Lois across the early seasons, built around his obsessive desire to kill her, fits the theory in a way that is uncomfortable to articulate but difficult to dismiss once it has been articulated. Babies have an intensely physical relationship with the person who feeds and cares for them, a relationship of total dependence that generates an emotional complexity babies cannot process or name. The desire to destroy the person on whom survival depends is not a coherent thought a real baby can have, but it is a reasonable metaphorical description of the ambivalence of total dependence, the way that needing someone utterly can generate something that resembles rage alongside the attachment. Stewie's matricidal obsession, filtered through the show's comedic register, is less shocking as a cartoon premise than it is when read as the show's way of rendering the specific emotional texture of a baby's complicated feelings about the person who controls everything in its world. The cutaway gags are the feature of the show's structure that the perspective theory explains most elegantly, and this elegance is worth examining in some detail because the cutaway gag has been one of the most persistently criticized elements of Family Guy across its run, with critics arguing that the device replaced storytelling with a series of unconnected images held together by nothing except Seth MacFarlane's willingness to reference any piece of pop culture within his reach. Under the perspective theory, the cutaway gags are not a storytelling failure. They are the structural consequence of a show filtered through an infant's attention and associative logic. Babies do not follow linear narrative. Their attention is captured by images, sounds, and emotional intensities, and their minds move between these stimuli through association rather than causation. A character says something, which reminds the baby of something it saw earlier, which leads to an image that has no plot connection to anything surrounding it, and then the current scene resumes. This is a description of how the cutaway gag works in almost every instance. It is also a description of how infant cognition actually moves through experience. Brian's role within the perspective theory deserves its own moment of careful examination, because Brian is the character who creates the most interesting complication for the reading. If the show is Stewie's perception of his world, then Brian's sophistication, his ability to hold adult conversations, his literary awareness, and his capacity for complex emotional response are features of how Stewie perceives the family dog rather than features of who the dog actually is. The theory's explanation for why the dog is sophisticated is that Stewie simply understands the dog as a member of the family, all of whom can speak and think in adult terms from Stewie's perspective, because that is how the people and creatures of a baby's world appear when a baby tries to make sense of them. Everyone around a baby seems to operate in a language the baby cannot quite access. The dog becomes, in this rendering, the member of the family whose language Stewie has most fully decoded, and so the dog appears in the show as the character most completely available to genuine communication with Stewie. This also explains something specific about the Brian and Stewie Road to episodes that no other theory quite accounts for. These episodes consistently involve Stewie and Brian operating together in elaborate situations that require competence, courage, and mutual trust of a kind the show elsewhere distributes unevenly across its cast. In the context of the perspective theory, the Road to episodes are the show at its most directly expressive of Stewie's interior life. Stories in which the figure he feels most connected to becomes his full partner in an adventure that his imagination has constructed around a real relationship. The road trips are not departures from the show's world. They are the show's world at its most honest about what it actually is. A baby's elaborated fantasy built on the real materials of his daily life, with the dog elevated to co-protagonist because the dog is the one who has always listened. The theory accommodates even the show's most overtly impossible episodes under this reading. The nuclear holocaust of the DeBoom episode, in which a Y2K computer bug triggers a worldwide apocalypse that the Griffin family survives by hiding in their basement, is exactly the kind of scenario a baby might construct around the emotional reality of a household in which something large and frightening is happening that the baby cannot understand. Adults responding to a major stressor by barricading themselves indoors and stockpiling supplies, behaving in ways that are unfamiliar and intense, would register to a baby as something close to the end of the world, because the baby has no framework for understanding what a manageable adult crisis looks like from the inside. The show renders the emotional experience directly, and the emotional experience of a frightened baby watching its family behave strangely around a threshold event is indistinguishable from an apocalypse. None of this was confirmed by the show's writers, who have addressed the hearing question and the cutaway gag structure in separate interviews, without ever connecting the two into anything resembling the perspective theory. MacFarlane's public explanations for the show's internal inconsistencies have consistently pointed toward the primacy of comedy over continuity. The idea that the writers make whatever choice produces the best joke in any given scene without treating earlier choices as binding constraints. points. This is an honest description of how the show operates. The perspective theory does not contradict it. It simply proposes that the consistent character of the inconsistencies, who hears Stewie, how physics behaves, how extreme Peter's behavior is allowed to become, how the cutaway gags move through association rather than causation, is not random noise produced by a room full of writers prioritizing jokes over logic. It is a coherent pattern that only becomes visible once the filter producing it is identified. A baby's perception of the world is not a neutral camera. It is an organizing intelligence working at full capacity on material that vastly exceeds its processing power, producing a version of reality that is emotionally accurate and factually unreliable in exactly the combination the show has always displayed. The perspective theory asks the audience to consider that Family Guy has been telling its audience what it is from the beginning, not through any deliberate choice the writers made, but through the consistent character of the show's own strange logic. The same logic that makes a dog a full conversational partner and a father into a force of nature and the whole world into a place where consequences are temporary. And the most important relationship in any room is the one between the smallest person present and the creature most reliably willing to listen to what that person has to say. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of whose perception the show inhabits connects naturally to a larger question about whether the show inhabits a single reality at all, or whether the most self-aware theory in the entire canon might be the one that removes the question of perception entirely and asks instead whether Family Guy has always been aware, at some level, that it is a television program being watched by an audience, and whether another television program in the same universe might know this too. Section 8. Two shows watching each other. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy in 1999 and American Dad in 2005, and from the outside the two shows look like variations on the same idea. Both center on an American family in a specific suburban setting. Both use an ensemble cast of neighbors and peripheral characters to generate storylines that the main family cannot produce on their own. Both carry the particular comic sensibility of a creator who is interested in the space between what American culture says about itself and what it actually does. The surface similarities are obvious enough that critics noted them immediately when American Dad premiered, treating the new show as a companion piece to the established one rather than as something genuinely separate. What the shows share runs deeper than surface similarity, and the theory at the center of this section argues that the connection between them is not simply a shared creator, or a shared network, or a shared general approach to adult animated comedy. The connection, the theory argues, is structural and internal, built into the shows themselves, visible in specific scenes that the shows have been accumulating across decades without ever fully acknowledging what those scenes add up to. The most straightforward version of the theory begins with a single moment in an American Dad episode. The episode in question features the character of Stan Smith, the CIA agent father who anchors American Dad, listing his favorite fictional dogs. Stan lists Brian Griffin, the Family Guy dog, as one of them. The word fictional is the weight-bearing element of that sentence. Stan Smith is not saying he enjoys watching a show called Family Guy the way a real person might enjoy a television program. He is referencing Brian Griffin as a fictional character, which means that from inside Stan's reality, Brian is not a real dog who exists somewhere in Rhode Island. Brian is a character in a story, which means Family Guy, as a complete work of fiction, exists within the world of American Dad as a piece of entertainment that the characters of American Dad can consume and reference. This is a small moment in a single episode, easy to miss, easy to treat as a throwaway joke that the writers did not intend to carry any particular weight. The theory built around it does not treat it as throwaway. It treats it as the clearest available statement of a relationship between the two, shows that other evidence from both programs has been building toward for years, a relationship in which Family Guy exists as a fictional television program inside the reality that American Dad inhabits, making the Griffins characters in a story rather than people in a world parallel to the Smiths. The evidence does not stop with Stan's list of fictional dogs. A separate American Dad scene exists, in which the production is briefly depicted from behind the camera, with a director calling cut, and the surrounding environment revealing itself as a set rather than a real location. The joke in context is about a milestone in the show's own joke count, the scene existing to mark a comedic achievement for American Dad itself, but the implication of having the fourth wall break in this direction is significant. If American Dad contains scenes in which its own fictional status is acknowledged by showing the machinery of its production, then American Dad is a show that knows it is a show, while simultaneously being a show in which Family Guy is a fictional television program. The layers involved in that arrangement are not immediately simple to think through, and the theory's supporters have spent considerable effort mapping them. A 15th season episode of Family Guy called Inside Family Guy provides the most elaborate piece of evidence from within the show itself. The episode offers what it frames as a behind-the-scenes look at how Family Guy is produced, depicting depicting the Griffin family as actors who play fictionalized versions of themselves for the television program the audience is watching. Peter Griffin in this episode is not Peter Griffin the character. He is a person who performs Peter Griffin for the cameras, with an identity and a life separate from the character he portrays. The same applies to the rest of the family. The episode uses this premise for its comedy, playing with the gap between who the characters appear to be when performing and who they apparently are when the cameras are not running. Inside Family Guy is unusual in the show's history because it takes the show's habitual fourth wall breaking, which is a regular feature across many episodes, and commits to it at the level of premise rather than using it as an occasional joke. Most fourth wall moments in Family Guy are brief interruptions, a character glancing at the camera, a cutaway gag that acknowledges its own structure, a line of dialogue that references the show's existence as a television program and then returns to the plot. Inside Family Guy builds an entire episode around the premise that the characters are aware they are performing, which raises the question of who they are performing for, and within what reality the performance is taking place. If the Griffins are actors performing Family Guy as a television program, then Family Guy the television program must exist within some larger reality in which it can be produced and broadcast and consumed. The theory connects this to the American Dad evidence and argues that the larger reality in which Family Guy exists as a produced television program is the reality of American Dad. The Griffins are characters in a show. The Smiths watch that show. Stan knows who Brian is because Stan has seen the program in which Brian appears. The two shows occupy different levels of reality within the same fictional ecosystem, with American Dad as the outer frame and Family Guy as the story being told within that frame. Reddit user Grandmaster Sexay extended this reading in a direction that adds additional complexity without requiring the basic argument to change. This user argued that Family Guy has always been a television show within a television show, meaning the fictional status of the Griffins is not something that was introduced by Inside Family Guy or by Stan's passing reference in American Dad. It is a condition that has characterized the show from its beginning, visible in retrospect through the accumulated evidence but not fully legible until the later pieces of evidence arrived to provide context for the earlier ones. Under this reading, the show's pervasive self-awareness, its constant references to its own existence as a television program, its habit of having characters acknowledge the camera, its willingness to have Peter break the fourth wall and list Fox's canceled shows in the season 4 premiere. All of these are features of a show that knows what it is because the show exists as a known thing, a produced piece of entertainment within the world that contains it. American Dad's own fictional status within this framework is handled by the same user's argument in a way that introduces a loop the theory's more casual versions tend to avoid. Grandmaster Sexay argued that American Dad also eventually became a television show within a television show, the behind-the-camera scene being the moment this happened. If American Dad started as the outer frame, the real world in which Family Guy is consumed as fiction, and then American Dad also revealed itself to be a produced television program with a set and a production crew, then the ecosystem has folded back on itself in a way that removes any stable outer frame from which either show can be watched as a straightforward reality. This is the point at which the theory shades into something that resembles a genuine structural puzzle rather than a fan reading of isolated moments. Two shows are each, at various points, treating themselves as fictional programs produced for an audience. Each show, at various points, treats the other as a fictional program consumed by its characters. The relationship between the two is not simply one of shared universe, where the Griffins and the Smiths might theoretically encounter each other in the same physical space if their Rhode Island suburb and their Washington, D.C. suburb happen to overlap. The relationship is hierarchical and unstable, with the hierarchy shifting depending on which piece of evidence is being considered at a given moment. The Susie Swanson detail adds a completely separate thread to the same general category of evidence, though it involves American Dad, rather than directly involving Family Guy's metatextual relationship to itself. Joe Swanson's infant daughter Susie appears occasionally across Family Guy's run, and the show has given the audience access to her inner monologue through a device that renders her thoughts in an adult voice. That adult voice is Patrick Stewart's. Patrick Stewart also voices the character of Avery Bullock in American Dad, the eccentric CIA director who serves as Stan Smith's superior officer. In a specific American Dad episode called Virtual Insanity, Bullock is shown to possess a CIA device that allows a person to remotely inhabit and control an avatar of any shape, and his avatar in that episode is a baby. The theory connecting these details, originally proposed by a Reddit user named T. Cromps, suggests that Susie Swanson is not an ordinary infant whose inner monologue happens to be expressed in Patrick Stewart's voice. Susie Swanson is one of Avery Bullock's avatars, a baby body being remotely operated by the American Dad CIA director, whose presence in the Family Guy universe is explicable only if the two shows exist within the same reality, and if Bullock has reasons for deploying an avatar inside the world of a show that might itself be fictional fictional from his perspective. The layers here are again difficult to hold steady, but the internal evidence is specific enough that the theory's construction does not feel arbitrary. The same actor's voice doing similar work in both shows, the established existence of baby avatars in one show, the unexplained sophistication of a baby's inner monologue in the other, these details were created independently, and they connect in a way that the shows themselves have never formally acknowledged. The crossover history between McFarlane's shows provides additional texture for the shared universe reading, without quite settling the fictional hierarchy question. The Night of the Hurricane event from 2011, in which Family Guy, American Dad, and The Cleveland Show each aired an episode set during the same storm system moving through their respective settings, established that the three shows' physical worlds are geographically connected. A hurricane that hit Stool Bend, Virginia in The Cleveland Show episode moved to Quahog, Rhode Island in the Family Guy episode, and then to Langley Falls, Virginia in the American Dad episode. Characters from one show appeared briefly in the episodes of the others. The event treated the three shows as existing within a continuous physical geography, rather than as separate fictional universes that happen to share a creator. This geographical continuity sits awkwardly alongside the evidence that Family Guy might be a fictional television program within American Dad's reality. If the Griffins and the Smiths share a physical world, then Stan cannot watch Family Guy as a television program, because television programs do not exist within the same physical reality as their viewers in the way a neighbor exists within the same physical reality as another neighbor. The hurricane event and the Brian as fictional dog moment point in different directions, and the theory has to accommodate both by treating them as existing at different levels of intentionality, with the hurricane crossover as a creative decision made without regard to the metatextual implications of Stan's earlier reference. Inside Family Guy is the piece that sits most uncomfortably within every version of this theory, because the episode cannot be neatly reconciled with a reading in which the Griffins are simply real people living in a world where a show about fictional Griffins is broadcast on television. If the show called Family Guy is a production with actors and sets and a production schedule, then the characters watching that show elsewhere in its universe are watching a show made by a production company employing actors, not watching a documentary about a real family in Rhode Island. The characters within Family Guy would need to be those actors, not the family the actors portray, which means the family the actors portray exists separately from the actors, as a set of fictional constructions that have an independent existence somewhere else in the same universe. The theory's most complete form does not try to resolve these contradictions into a single clean hierarchy. It simply maps them, noting that the shows have accumulated enough self-referential and cross-referential material across their combined run to make the question of their relationship to each other genuinely interesting, rather than definitively answerable. Two shows watching each other while being watched by an audience outside both is not a stable system. It is an arrangement that keeps collapsing into itself whenever any single piece of evidence is followed far enough. The theory exists not as an answer to the question of how the two shows relate, but as the most complete available description of the question itself, built from the specific moments each show has produced that refuse to stay inside the ordinary reading of two separate programs sharing a creator and a network and a general sensibility without sharing anything more structurally significant than that. The value of sitting with this particular theory is not in arriving at a conclusion about whether Family Guy is definitely a fictional television program within American Dad's reality, or definitely a parallel universe existing alongside it, or definitely a show produced by actors living within its own world. The value is in noticing that the shows themselves have produced enough material to make all three of these readings simultaneously available, and that a creative enterprise spanning decades can accidentally accumulate a relationship with its own fictional status complex enough to generate a genuine structural puzzle without anyone in the writer's rooms of either show sitting down and intending to produce one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of how many layers of reality Family Guy actually inhabits is the kind of question that can only arise from a show that has been running long enough to accumulate evidence it never intended to produce. The next theory in this video is built around a similar kind of accidental accumulation, one involving not the show's relationship to another program, but its relationship to its own internal timeline, and the specific episode from 1999 that some fans argue quietly destroyed and rebuilt the entire world the show takes place in. Section 9, the episode that ended the world and nobody noticed, December 26, 1999. Family Guy had been on the air for 11 months. The show had launched in January of that year to enormous ratings after Fox aired it immediately following the Super Bowl, drawing an audience that few television programs ever see. Then watch those numbers fall steadily across its first season as Fox moved it to increasingly difficult time slots against stronger competition. By the time the second season began, the show had already been pulled from Thursday nights against Frasier after only 2 episodes, its audience shrinking fast enough that nobody at the network would have been surprised if the whole thing simply ended ended without ceremony. The episode that aired on December 26, 1999, the third episode of that second season, was called Da Boom. It destroyed the world. The premise is precise and immediate. On New Year's Eve, a man in a chicken suit warns Peter that the Y2K computer bug will cause an apocalypse at midnight. Peter, applying the specific brand of logic that defines him in the early seasons, takes this warning at face value and locks his entire family in the basement wearing hazmat suits, missing the New Year's Eve party Quagmire has been planning. Midnight arrives. The Y2K bug strikes. Missiles self-launch. Vehicles crash. The world outside the Griffin basement is subjected to a nuclear holocaust that kills many of Quahog's residents outright and mutates many of the survivors. Cleveland and Quagmire are fused together at the torso and spend the episode debating which combined name they prefer. Joe's wheelchair melts into his driveway. Meg's date Kevin Swanson is vaporized. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the local news anchors, cook and eat their Asian colleague Trisha Takanawa. The Griffins emerge from their basement into the ruins of a civilization and begin walking toward Natick, Massachusetts, where Peter believes a Twinkie factory might still be standing. On the way to Natick, Stewie falls into a puddle of nuclear waste. His arms mutate into octopus tentacles. By the time the family reaches the factory and establishes the new settlement of New Quahog around its supplies, Stewie's lower body has transformed entirely into the body of an octopus, and the mutation continues across the episode until, near the climax, he begins laying eggs. The eggs hatch. The offspring kill everyone in New Quahog. The Griffins, ejected from the town by an angry mob moments before the massacre, escape by accident and set off toward a Carvel factory in Framingham, Massachusetts, singing a traveling song as the credits approach. Then the episode ends with a live-action sequence. Pamela Ewing, played by Victoria Principal, wakes up in bed next to Bobby Ewing, played by Patrick Duffy. She tells Bobby about the strange dream she just had, describing the events of the episode. Bobby listens, comforts her, and then pauses. He asks what Family Guy is. The two turn to look directly into the camera with expressions of confusion. The screen goes dark. This ending is a parody of one of the most famous reveals in American soap opera history. The 9th season of Dallas had killed off Bobby Ewing, a major character, only for the 10th season to reveal that the entire previous season had been a dream experienced by his wife Pamela. The controversial decision allowed the show to bring back a popular character while discarding an entire year of story, and it became one of the most discussed moments in 1980s television. Da Boom borrowed the structure of that reveal and applied it to its own nuclear apocalypse, with the actual Pam and Bobby Ewing appearing in live action to deliver the joke. The implication was clear. The entire episode had been a dream. The world was not destroyed. The Griffins were fine. Stewie was not an octopus. Normal service would resume. The theory that a significant portion of Family Guy's fan community has since built around this episode begins from a single skeptical question. How do the audience know it was a dream? The answer the episode provides is the Dallas parody at the end. A joke built on borrowed structure from a soap opera, the target demographic was unlikely to have followed closely in the mid-1980s. The reveal is presented as a parody of a famous narrative device rather than as a straightforward plot resolution, which means the episode is not simply telling the audience the events were not real. It is telling them using the language of self-aware comedy, in a sequence that exists at a different layer of reality from the rest of the episode, featuring real actors from a different fictional universe commenting on the events of the show as though it were a dream that Pamela Ewing had. The joke is funny precisely because it is formally absurd, a solution borrowed from a completely unrelated property, applied to a situation that does not quite fit it. The theory asks whether a formally absurd resolution presented as a joke should be read as a reliable statement about what actually happened within the show's internal reality. The version of the theory that argues Da Boom is canon takes the position that the dream ending is a piece of comedic misdirection rather than a genuine narrative resolution, that the events of the episode actually occurred within the Family Guy universe, and that the show's subsequent return to normal life in the episodes that followed is what requires explanation rather than the apocalypse itself. Under this reading, the Griffin family survived a worldwide nuclear holocaust at the turn of the millennium. Everything that happened in the episode, the mutations, the collapsed civilization, the new settlement, the mass death of Quahog residents, was real. The Griffins walked away from it because the show requires them to walk away from everything eventually, and then they went home and resumed their lives in a Quahog that had, according to the episode's own internal logic, been largely destroyed by nuclear weapons on New Year's Eve 1999. The implications of this reading for the episodes that follow are strange enough to be worth tracing carefully. If the world of Family Guy experienced a nuclear holocaust in December 1999, and Quahog was significantly damaged in the process, then the Quahog depicted in every subsequent episode is a rebuilt city, populated by survivors of the event and whatever new residents arrived afterward, operating as though the apocalypse had not happened, because that is simply what survivors of catastrophic events eventually do. The characters do not discuss discuss the Y2K disaster in later episodes because the show does not operate as a continuous timeline where past events are acknowledged with any reliability. The disaster happened, and then life continued, and the show moved forward without looking back, the same way it moves forward after every impossible event across its run. This also connects to something specific about the show's established relationship to its own continuity. Family Guy has never treated episode-to-episode continuity as a serious obligation. Characters who die return. Events that should have lasting consequences do not. The physical destruction of Quahog in Daboom would not be treated differently by the show's internal logic than the destruction of Quahog in any other episode. The reset is simply applied more aggressively than usual, because the scale of what needs to be reset is larger than usual. Under the canon theory, the difference between Daboom and any other episode in which Quahog is damaged, or a character experiences something apparently permanent, is simply one of degree. The show always resets. The Y2K reset was bigger. The size of the reset does not make the preceding event less real. The mutation that happened to Stewie during the episode is the piece of the canon theory that generates the most specific and interesting discussion. If Stewie was genuinely exposed to nuclear waste, and his body genuinely transformed into a hybrid octopus creature during the episode, then the question of what happened to that mutation between the end of Daboom and the next episode requires some kind of answer. The most straightforward answer available within the theory is that the reset happened at a biological level as well. That whatever mechanism the show uses to restore characters to their default state after episodes involving physical transformation was simply applied to Stewie as it has been applied to many other characters across the show's history. But the theory's more ambitious reading suggests something else. If the mutation happened at the genetic level, then Stewie, in every subsequent episode, is carrying the genetic material of his octopus transformation without it being visibly expressed. This explains nothing about the show's subsequent episodes in any practical sense. It is simply the logical consequence of taking the episode's events seriously as real biological facts rather than cartoon premises that the dream-ending excuses from consequence. The character of Kevin Swanson, Meg's date, who is described in the episode as having been vaporized by the nuclear blast, provides a different kind of evidence for the canon theory. Kevin Swanson does not appear in the show for many seasons following Daboom. When he eventually returns, the episode acknowledges his absence through a joke about his having been away at war. This return was read by some fans as evidence that the show itself was treating the events of Daboom as having actually happened within the timeline, since Kevin's disappearance and eventual return are handled with enough deliberateness to suggest someone in the writer's room was aware of the continuity question. Whether this represents intentional acknowledgement of the canon theory or simply a writer deciding to bring back a character and explaining the gap in whatever way was available is genuinely ambiguous, which is part of what keeps the theory in circulation. The Dallas parody ending carries its own layer of complexity worth examining separately from the theory about whether the events were real. The specific reference the episode chose was not arbitrary. The Dallas Dream season was, at the time of its revelation in 1986, one of the most widely criticized narrative decisions in American television history. The reaction from viewers and critics was intensely negative, built on the feeling that the show had spent an entire season generating emotional investment in events that it then retroactively declared to have never happened, leaving the audience with nothing to show for a year of watching. Family Guy's use of this exact narrative device, applied to an episode in which an entire world was destroyed, is a formal joke about the limits of the dream resolution as a storytelling tool. It is the show borrowing a device that audiences already understood as a cheat, applying it to a situation far more extreme than the original, and then presenting it through the mouths of actors from the original context rather than through characters within the show's own world. The joke works precisely because the device is known to be a cheat. The theory asks whether the show was, through this particular joke, quietly signaling that the cheat was a cheat, that the dream ending was not meant to be taken at face value any more than the original Dallas version was. This interpretation requires treating the episode's formal choices as intentional statements about the show's relationship to its own continuity, rather than simply as jokes, which is a larger methodological commitment than most casual fan theories ask for. The alternative, that the writers simply thought the Dallas parody was funny and used it without intending any secondary meaning about the canon status of the episode's events, is equally plausible. The show's own track record of treating formal devices primarily as vehicles for jokes, rather than as meaningful structural statements, supports the simpler reading. Daboom's Dallas ending was almost certainly conceived as a joke first, and a philosophical statement about narrative truth second, if it was conceived as a philosophical statement at all. What makes the canon theory worth examining seriously despite this is what it reveals about how the show handles the relationship between impossible events and the normal life that follows them. Accepting that Daboom actually happened does not require more interpretive flexibility than accepting any other episode of Family Guy as belonging to the same story. The show has always operated in a mode where events of apocalyptic scale occur, and then life continues as though they did not, where the reset is not explained but simply applied, where the gap between what happened and what the show acknowledges having happened is so wide and so permanent that continuity has never been the basis on which the show asks to be understood. Da Boom is simply the most extreme version of this pattern, the one in which the thing being reset is not a character's death or a destroyed building, but the entire civilized world. The IGN review of the episode gave it a perfect score of 10 out of 10, calling it one of the best episodes in the series and describing the far-fetched alternate reality storyline as thoroughly entertaining. The reviewer noted that despite all events being revealed as a dream, this did not diminish the entertainment the episode provided. Tom Eames, reviewing the episode for Digital Spy and ranking it among the show's best, described it as classic and noted that it marked potentially the first time viewers realized Family Guy was not simply a Simpsons imitation. Both reviewers accepted the dream ending without question, treating it as a clean resolution of an episode that had clearly not intended its apocalypse to be permanent. The theory simply refuses that acceptance and asks what the show looks like if the clean resolution is not accepted at all. If the world that ended on December 26, 1999, inside a Fox animated comedy, is understood as having actually ended, and the show's 20-plus subsequent seasons are understood as taking place inside whatever came after. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of whether Da Boom actually ended the world the show inhabits is ultimately a question about how much trust the audience places in the show's own stated resolutions, and that question of trust connects to the final theory in this video, one that does not ask about any single episode, but about the entire Griffin family, and the specific biological question of whether the people living at 31 Spooner Street are actually related to each other at all. Section 10. The family that was never quite a family. At some point across Family Guy's long run, a viewer paying close attention to the show's accumulated throwaway lines, background jokes, and minor revelations might notice something that does not quite resolve into a clean picture. The Griffin family, which is the structural center of every episode across every season, is not entirely certain who its members actually are. Peter is probably not Meg's biological father. Chris may have come from a Dutch family the Griffins never discuss. Stewie's conception involved time travel in at least one account. And sitting underneath all of that, waiting to be examined, is the theory that Meg and Stewie are not siblings at all, but are, in the most specific biological sense, mother and son. The family whose dysfunction has powered 20-plus seasons of American animated comedy may not share the genetic connections it presents as given, and the show has been dropping evidence of this across its entire run without ever deciding whether any of it is true. The Meg and Stan Thompson detail arrived in the third season, in an episode called Screwed the Pooch. The episode puts Brian on a witness stand in a custody dispute over his puppies, with Peter attempting to demonstrate Brian's fitness as a father by establishing how well he knows the Griffin children. Brian responds to each question with information about the kids that Peter himself does not know, including Chris's favorite ice cream flavor and Stewie's preferred bedtime story. When the question of Meg's real father comes up, Brian answers with a name, Stan Thompson. The information is delivered as a throwaway line in the middle of a scene building toward a different joke. Meg herself is wearing headphones at the moment of the revelation and does not hear it. The family does not react with shock or explanation. The scene moves on as though nothing significant was said. What makes this detail more than a single disposable joke is that the show returned to it. Brian references Stan Thompson again in a later episode, telling the family directly that if there were a god in the world, Meg would know about him, to which every other character in the room immediately shushes him, not wanting Meg to overhear. This second reference is the show confirming that the first was not accidental. The name is a fact inside the story's world, understood by every member of the main cast except the one person it concerns most directly. Peter has referenced Thompson in at least 2 additional moments, once wondering to himself what might have happened if he had left Meg with her biological father, and once drawing a comparison between his own discovery of non-biological paternity and the situation he shares with Meg, before realizing he said too much and wiping her memory of the conversation in a joke drawn from the Men in Black films. The cumulative weight of these references across separate seasons and separate episodes establishes Stan Thompson as a sustained background fact rather than a one-time gag. He is someone the family knows about, actively conceals from Meg, and returns to periodically as a source of dark humor without ever producing him as a character or resolving what his existence means for Meg's understanding of herself. The show built a secret into its central family in its third season and has maintained that secret unresolved across every season since. Stan Thompson's name exists in the show's archive as a joke about a fact the audience is told but never shown. A man referenced across multiple seasons who has never appeared and who the show has shown no intention of using for anything beyond the specific comedic purpose of reminding the audience that the family at the center of everything is not quite what it appears to be. Chris's parentage is handled even more lightly. A throwaway line in a later episode has Lois mentioning that Chris was taken from a Dutch family, delivered in a context built around a joke rather than a revelation. No Dutch family appears, no origin story is developed, no episode pursues it. The line sits in the show's broadcast history as an admission that at least 2 of the 3 Griffin children may have arrived in the household from somewhere other than the marriage at its center, dropped with the same casualness the show applies to most of the facts it generates and abandons. The pattern across Meg, Chris, and Stewie is of a show that has been quietly, almost accidentally, constructing a version of the Griffin family in which biological parentage is far more uncertain than the premise suggests, and then declining to do anything about it beyond the occasional joke that reminds the audience the uncertainty is there. Stewie's own origins contain a detail that removes conventional biological parentage from the picture in a completely different way. An episode built around the question of how Stewie came to exist establishes that his conception required the adult future Stewie to travel back in time and deliberately trigger the sequence of events that led to his own birth. This is a causal loop of a kind that makes the ordinary question of who Stewie's father is somewhat secondary to the stranger question of what it means to be responsible for your own existence before you exist. The show presents this as a science fiction comedy premise rather than as a serious piece of backstory, but it places Stewie's origins in a category entirely separate from how either of his nominal siblings arrived in the world. Meg came from someone named Stan Thompson. Chris may have come from the Netherlands. Stewie came, in a meaningful sense, from himself. The theory connecting these details to a specific claim about Meg begins with the general observation that the biological structure of the family is already compromised across all 3 children before the theory adds anything of its own. The argument that Meg is Stewie's biological mother rather than his sister was circulating in fan communities before the episode that provided its most specific piece of in-show support. The basic version holds that Meg became pregnant by a boyfriend at some point before or during the show's timeline, and that Lois and Brian together arranged to conceal the pregnancy, raising the resulting child as Lois's own. The motivations offered for the concealment vary across different versions of the theory, with some pointing to Meg's age at the time as the primary reason, and others pointing to Peter's probable reaction as the thing the family most needed to prevent. The in-show evidence sits in an episode called Partial Terms of Endearment, the 8th season episode that Fox declined to broadcast in the United States due to its subject matter around surrogacy and abortion. The episode aired in the United Kingdom and was eventually released on DVD in America, which means it reached audiences outside the standard broadcast channel rather than through the show's primary distribution. The episode's central plot involves Lois agreeing to serve as a surrogate mother for a college friend. During a conversation about surrogacy and who in the family might carry a baby, Meg volunteers herself. Lois responds to this suggestion with a line that translates to saying it was hard enough on Meg's body when she gave birth to Stewie, before immediately following the statement with the phrase, "Just kidding." The laugh track plays. The scene continues. The theory's argument about this moment is built specifically around Meg's response to what was said, or rather, the absence of a response. The show tracks its own punchlines. When something is said that concerns a character directly, that character typically reacts, even if the reaction is itself a joke. Meg's silence in the moment immediately following Lois's statement is the detail the theory treats as meaningful. A purely fictional claim delivered as a joke would be expected to produce denial, confusion, or some acknowledgement from the character the claim is about. The absence of any reaction from Meg is read as the possibility that Lois accidentally disclosed something real in a setting where the framing as humor provided cover for the disclosure. Whether Meg's silence reflects genuine knowledge on her part or is simply a production oversight is genuinely impossible to determine from the available evidence, which is part of what keeps the theory in circulation rather than in any settled conclusion. The episode itself exists at the margins of the show's official record, in a way that gives its content a particular quality within discussions of what the show has and has not confirmed. Fox's decision not to air it meant that American audiences encountered it outside the standard relationship between network broadcast and audience reception. The fact that the single most specific piece of evidence for the biological mother theory exists in an episode the network considered too controversial to air in its home market gives the whole construction an additional layer of remove from anything the show has definitively put forward as part of its official story. Stewie's relationship with Lois, which defined his character in the early seasons through the running premise of his obsessive desire to kill her, takes on a different texture when read through the biological mother theory. The show explained this hostility through the comedic premise that Stewie resented being inside her body for 9 months. If the theory has any validity, the hostility is directed at the wrong person, at the woman who raised him rather than the woman who carried him. The theory suggests that Stewie's early antagonism toward Lois reflects something the show never names directly, the feeling of someone placed inside a family arrangement that does not quite fit and who cannot articulate why. The resentment exists at a level below the comedy premise that contains it, and the comedy premise is what the show uses whenever Stewie's feelings about Lois come come close to something the audience might otherwise read with more weight than the show intends. The relationship between Stewie and Meg within the regular run of the show adds its own thread. Stewie joins the household consensus in treating Meg as the designated target, but the quality of his contempt for her has a specific personal edge that distinguishes it from Peter's careless cruelty or Lois's passive acceptance. The theory reads this as something more complicated than ordinary sibling dynamics, the hostility of someone with unresolved feelings about a person they are connected to more deeply than the household arrangement suggests, processed through the only register available in the show's comedic world, which is contempt delivered quickly enough that nothing behind it has to be examined. The Griffin family DNA theories share a structural quality that makes them interesting collectively beyond what any individual claim about paternity contains. The show built a family as its premise, and then spent over 2 decades quietly undermining the biological foundations of that family through lines and jokes it never retracted and never followed through. The family at 31 Spooner Street is held together not by blood, which the show has been systematically questioning since its 3rd season, but by shared address, daily proximity, and the accumulated habit of people who have ended up living together under circumstances nobody within the story has fully explained. This is also, when viewed alongside everything covered across this entire video, the final pattern that all 10 of these theories share. The grief hallucination, the constructed identity, the alternate universe, the lightning rod, the alcoholic decline, the death and resurrection, the infant perspective, the metatextual loop between shows, the Y2K canon question, and now the biological family mystery are all working toward the same underlying question through different methods. The question is simply what holds Family Guy together as a coherent thing when nothing inside it is required to be consistent, when characters can contradict themselves across seasons, when families can be biologically uncertain while remaining structurally essential, when worlds can end and quietly resume the following week. Every theory in this video arrives at the same place eventually. The show holds together because the audience holds it together. Brian's decline makes more sense read as alcoholism than as ordinary character drift, because the audience needs deterioration to have a shape rather than being purely random. DeBoom needs to be canon or not canon because an event of that scale cannot simply sit in the archive as neither real nor fictional without the people who watched it needing to know which it was. Stan Thompson needs to be someone the show will eventually produce, because fathers do not exist as permanent punchlines without raising the question of what happens when the joke stops being enough. Meg as Stewie's biological mother needs to be either true or explicitly false, because a family relationship implied and then immediately denied in the same sentence does not simply disappear from a viewer's awareness once the next joke arrives. Family Guy does not answer these questions because Family Guy has never been a show built around the obligation to answer anything. The cutaway gag structure that defines it is the formal expression of a show that generates material faster than it tracks consequences, that builds details into the architecture of its world without ever planning to use most of them. The fan theories produced around it are not evidence of hidden depths the creators embedded in the work. They are evidence of what audiences do when a show generates more material than it can be responsible for, which is to take responsibility for it themselves, to find the connections the show declined to make, to impose coherence on incoherence not because the show deserves coherence but because the audience does. Over 2 decades, more than 400 episodes, and a cast of characters whose genetic relationships to each other have never quite been settled, Family Guy has produced one of the richest ecosystems of fan theory in the history of American animated comedy. Not because it is a particularly deep show, but because it is a particularly full one, packed with details that accumulate without resolving, with jokes that establish facts the show abandons, with a family that is somehow both the most familiar and the least explained thing at the center of every episode it has ever made. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.